Okay, we're live. Part 2, Great Angel. Chapters 4 and 5 this week. The first one was the evidence of wisdom, right? Wisdom literature, and wisdom as that thing in Christian and Jewish literature, an entity. And then chapter 5, the evidence, I forget what it was called, of the angels. I loved chapter 4. I thought it was incredible. Chapter 5 just was really all over the place. I didn't know what to make of it. What did you guys think?
Doug, you're going to have to convince me that chapter 4 was actually any good.
Okay.
I'm with you.
Chapter 4.
Yeah, I'm with you guys too. I enjoyed chapter 4, but chapter 5 was hard going, and I was looking forward to this discussion to help me make sense of the points she was trying to get at.
It was overkill.
Yeah, it was just a really exhaustive look at, like, just a whole broad look at angelology and how angels are portrayed and talked about in Christian and Jewish literature, apocryphal and canonical. It's just like, whoa, there's a lot.
Yeah, I'm just not really convinced that the evidence that she's presenting really makes her thesis. I'm seeing a lot of stuff to me that looks irrelevant, and other stuff where I check the biblical passages, I just cannot see them as saying what she says they say.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just, I don't know, I'm having a hard time getting the big picture out of these individual chapters.
Yeah.
The problem I had with 5 is that, a lot of what she was saying there would be true if it meant what it meant in the apocryphal literature, if there was a real relationship between it. Not always is it obvious, or she really has to go through a lot of twists and turns in order to make it that way. But if you don't agree, if you think, well, that the Old Testament is not really in light of what you just said, then it kind of doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
One of the things... Sorry, go ahead.
I'm just going to say that I agree with Wayne, too, that frequently when she quotes a passage to support her case, I frequently can't see how that passage supports her case, or the way she's interpreting it. I question it like Wayne the whole time, like I don't really see what she's seeing.
Well, except Wayne also pointed out... Sorry.
I was just going to say, I felt that in chapter 5 way more than 4.
Well,
but yeah, I was getting that feeling too.
Wayne pointed something out that I hadn't thought of, because I was saying I don't know anything about her. But he pointed out that he seems to think that she actually believes. It's not just a matter of scholarship for her. She's kind of a believer in some form of this form of First Temple angelology kind of projection thing. Are you guys kind of with that?
I don't really know that much about her either, so
Okay.
I don't know if that's effective.
I think she believes in her thesis, but I think the religious motivation she has is related to what she thinks is a more authentic liturgy, because being a Methodist, there's still a liturgical church that she belongs to. So, for her, if she can come to like a better understanding of a more authentic Christian liturgy from a more authentic Judaism, I think that's what motivates her to do these works.
Right, but given this is a point that I made earlier too. I actually, just the thing with me, I actually think that being a believer, a Christian believer, actually is a little bit, not always, but sometimes, a little bit of a liability when it comes to, in the name of forthrightness and honesty and scholarship. And so, do you think it influences her thesis? In other words, I guess what I'm asking is do you think that she's prone to cherry picking because of it?
Well, I'm pretty sure she's prone to cherry picking. That's one of my other complaints.
She may be, but
it's not really cherry picking if you engage almost the entire Old Testament and all the Apocrypha in your argument. I mean, that's like bringing everything to bear, but it's whether or not the interpretations.
Yeah. It's more like a Texas sharpshooter, where it's kind of like you're seeing the patterns and kind of it's like the hammer metaphor too. Like when what you're holding is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so her angelology kind of a thesis, she just bangs that hammer on every single like possible.
Yeah. But I started color coding the book as I'm reading through it, and using red for things that I object to or just can't agree with her on. Kind of orange for stuff I question, but I'm not really sure that she's wrong. Yellow for just general comments, and like green for stuff I'll follow her on that point.
Okay, cool. So
but it's mostly red. This whole all my highlighting is mostly orange and red.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah, but there's one point early on that's just, it's not necessarily wrong in a way, but it's just I don't think she understands necessarily what she's talking about. Just on page 49, when it's talking about feminine imagery used of Yahweh in Deuteronomy and in the second Isaiah. And Yahweh was the one who gave birth to his people. Yeah, that's what the text says, but that can be interpreted both as a father or a mother figure. It's not necessarily the way the language is used there, a maternal thing. But it's the part after it that really got me, though. It's watched over them as an eagle watches over its young. I'm curious if she knows anything about eagles, because in eagles, both parents care for the young. In fact, I was watching a video on YouTube just a couple of weeks ago where a father eagle was feeding, bits of a squirrel to the young, and the mother eagle then flew into the nest and wanted to feed him and stuff, and was fighting with the father for a chance to feed the young. And eventually, he relented and gave her some pieces to give to the kids. But
yeah, I think the biggest thing I disagreed with her, say in chapter 4, was that Yahweh was considered a dual deity that had female and male aspects. I think the archaeology is pretty clear that there were two separate male and female deities.
Yeah, I get what she says about Asherah. I'm not really questioning her there. And there was another one she mentioned, and I forgot the name of it. It's only mentioned in one Old Testament passage. I'm trying to remember. Oh, Queen of Heaven. And I'll even follow her on the point that the Queen of Heaven is very likely the same as Asherah. But when she talks about the wisdom figure, I do not follow her there. To me, all the Old Testament text is talking about wisdom, understanding, teaching. I mean, the actual concept of knowledge personified. And all the descriptions are to that point. And I see nothing in Sirach, nothing in Proverbs and elsewhere that gives me any hint that there is like a deity, originally behind those passages. I'm just not seeing that. There are personification of wisdom, and that's it. Now she mentions in this chapter that that's a general understanding that arose later, but I'm not finding her evidence that it meant anything else in an earlier time period. So
what do you think about like in Enoch where it talks about the Shekinah, like that aspect of Yahweh, the Shekinah? Did you think that didn't help her case at all?
Well, wisdom has always been associated with feminine, with the feminine.
Yes.
And we all, and I think she's building on that. I think she's doing like a feminist interpretation of it. Yeah. But then it's just hard because, so she goes from the talking about this feminine wisdom aspect of God, and then the next chapter she talks about Metatron.
I think that you could argue that those characteristics of female were later additions rather than essential earlier. I like Wayne said, I don't think she strongly proved that there was like an evolution from a divine feminine, even though it was taken like that later on. I think it's hard to prove that was a feminine type of deity that kind of evolved into that later on. I think that's hard to prove.
But yeah, beyond that, I think there's a little bit absent from feminine wisdom to Metatron. It's just, I don't know, there's something weird there to me. It's like just a little bit of a disconnect, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
On this business of the divine feminine as wisdom as a female deity and the divine aspect, the female aspect of Yahweh, I couldn't help but see. I guess one thing that helped persuade me of the possibility, at least, although as you guys are suggesting, this could be just a later development and not a pre-exilic situation, is the fact that Ishtar, I see a connection. She sees a connection between Ishtar and Ashtoreth. She says that the Babylonian goddess Ishtar was the goddess of wisdom, the wisdom goddess. I see. Wouldn't take too much to convince me that there's a connection between Ishtar and Ashtoreth. And
But I think more directly is the Astarte, the Canaanite deity. And I think she specifically mentioned, didn't she, that there was some question about her role as wisdom in the Canaanite mythology?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Even if there is a connection between like Asherah and wisdom, or Asherah and these other names in the other neighboring nations' cults, I'm just not seeing it as at the root of Proverbs or Sirach. I mean,
Well, remember that they're not.
The writings there seem to be written, talking with only wisdom, as a personification of knowledge in mind. And I see no evidence there that any deity was in mind.
She's digging for fossils there. Yeah, she's saying that the overlay of the Greek Hellenization of that period by then was quite sophisticated, but can she find legitimate fossils of wisdom in there as an earlier expression?
What do you guys think of her case on some more of the female aspects of Yahweh? Like, I thought the most powerful stuff was from Isaiah. Like, Yahweh is described as a woman in labor in Isaiah 42:14. It says, "But now, like a woman in childbirth, I cry out, I gasp and pant."
What page you on?
Page 50. And then it also says, Yahweh is even more mindful than a mother who cannot forget her child, Isaiah 49:14 through 15. And then Isaiah confronts Zion as a man, quote, is comforted by his mother.
I put Isaiah 42:14 in red in my code because it has nothing about Yahweh himself being feminine. It's describing how he's crying.
I don't remember the only time I looked for him where it was when I was getting those old.
I'm sorry, talking at the same time as John.
Receipts that were.
Oh, it's talking to me. Okay.
Yeah.
It's just describing how hard Yahweh is crying for them to hear him. So in order to describe the crying, they're comparing it, to other types of crying that you compare it to, like a battle cry or a cry of a woman in labor and stuff. But it's just a metaphor to describe the crying. It's not actually assigning any feminine properties to Yahweh.
But then what about the masculine ways he's described too, like a mighty warrior? I mean, you could just say that those are just...
In that particular section, yes, it's just describing how he's crying, correct, and how he's shouting to be heard.
I think he does. I think she does a really good job of reviewing the connection between just the Hebrew traditions of Sophia, or I should say wisdom, Shekinah. I think she does a really good job of reviewing that tradition, but I don't think she does a good job of equating it with the angel of Yahweh.
Yeah. Now, the passages from First Enoch, I'd be more willing to follow her on, but I don't really have a good copy of First Enoch in front of me right now to really research the passages. But if what she's right about the apocalypse of weeks, which she mentions on page 50, and in the 6 weeks, those who lived in the temple became blind and godlessly forsook wisdom, I could possibly follow her on that, but I need to research it more. Whether that actually looks like it's in a context that's referring to a deity, or whether they mean wisdom in another sense.
Wayne, just speaking more generally, you're focusing on certain details, but my comment, just more generally, I was thinking about something you said at the very beginning before we went live, basically to the effect that you felt she was, actually you and Leon basically indicating that her personal beliefs are influencing her theory here.
I don't necessarily say that way. I'm not really seeing that her personal beliefs are influencing her theory.
Well, at first,
but I just take pause at the fact that I believe she actually, as a matter of faith, believes what her theory tells her.
Right.
I think what necessary.
The reason why I bring this up is because at first I didn't see it either, but as I'm starting to think, it could possibly be seen in the fact that her theory basically is anything that Jesus is identified with, that's what the pre-exilic Jews believed. And so if Jesus is Yahweh, if Jesus is wisdom, which is also part of Christian tradition, if Jesus is the angel of Yahweh also, so anything that she sees connected with anything Jesus is, so Yahweh must have been in the Old Testament, and that could be driving her to see these parallels that may not exactly exist.
Bingo. That's a way of putting it. That actually goes beyond what I said earlier, but I might actually agree with you on that.
Yeah, I think you just put your finger on what I've been saying.
The Isaiah thing I can see.
I don't want to put this book down the entire time, though, so I want you guys to convince me that there's more value here.
Well, I mean, everyone has a right to their opinion, so don't feel bad about that.
I think I might be missing something.
The Isaiah thing I can see, yeah, it's talking metaphorically, so it's not necessarily talking about like an aspect of Yahweh himself. Although I think there's a lot of motherly imagery in there, but you're right, it doesn't prove her case.
Isaiah wants to use imagery that the people, Yahweh is preaching to can understand. And he doesn't want to just address men. He wants to, give analogies that both men and women can understand and follow. So if he's only talking about battle analogies, it's not that great for his women listeners.
Yeah. The other thing, too, is, like, that's just one of her case, one part of her case. Like, I found the parallels to the Canaanite, which, remember, it was Jewish, or Israelite. He talked about, I think someone mentioned it earlier, where was it? I just saw it in my notes. Oh, yeah. Lady Atarat, which is the consort of El, and she was also called in Ugaritic literature that they've recovered Elot, and she was just the female form of El, and was said to be the mother of 70 sons, just as Elohim was, which we read in Deuteronomy, the sons of El and the 70 nations and all that. So if there's any parallel there, that would, I mean, if it's going on in the Canaanite pantheon, it wouldn't seem like it's too much of a stretch that the Israelites would be doing it too. And then you got the stuff in Isaiah, and then what'd you guys think of the descriptions of like Adam being a hermaphrodite and the cherubim on the ark? Those things, you didn't buy those either?
I see. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I basically see the whole book. This book is kind of a very complex midrash, an advanced midrash. And that's the first thing. But the second thing that I'll say, I don't mean to belittle it, because in her defense, I'll say that, yeah, it is highly speculative in the sense that she's doing her own midrash. But isn't that what all kind of, given the dearth of evidence that we have, basically the text that we have, it's all kind of speculative. And so,
remember, she told us at the outset of the book that, I mean, she gave us a giant disclaimer, like, look, this is just my interpretation of the evidence. So, yeah.
So I say that in her defense, and she is building, I mean, she's a really, really good, speculation builder. she's looking for every little bit that she can put on that nest, you know.
Mm-hmm.
You asked about the Adam being a hermaphrodite, which she mentions on page 49.
Yeah.
That's where's she getting that from? The Jewish Christian Pseudo-Clementine homilies and Philo, she's mentioning. I guess it was Philo seems to criticize the idea that he was a
Right.
hermaphrodite. But what gets me is that hermaphrodite seems to be way too specific and technical of a term, that I'm wondering if that term even existed in those ancient languages and what phrasing they would have used, where that's actually a good translation or not.
Well,
Yeah,
and
I'm not sure, but it's like the curious thing in Genesis that we've all read, like he created them in his image, he created them male and female.
male and female
Yeah.
created him
My-
or whatever.
Yeah, my understanding of that passage in Genesis is just that it comes from a polytheistic time, and it was doctored over to make to make one god out of many, but it wasn't doctored over. They missed things when they doctored it.
Yeah, but from a monotheistic from a monotheistic millennium later perspective,
Yeah.
that's the way they saw it. Some
Yeah,
people saw it anyway.
Yeah. I just think that's a remnant from the gods plural creating mankind in their image, male and female, because they were male and female gods at that time, or believe the writers, the original did.
I agree with you that I don't really see it. I never really saw it in the Genesis text, but I do know that that is part of Christian tradition, that Adam was created both male and female. Some have said that in the past, in the ancient past, that Adam was created male and female until God decided to separate the female aspect of Adam into Eve.
Yeah, it's not a scandalous proposition.
Right, and so again, this seems to me an possible example of reading Christian tradition back into the Old Testament.
It also sounds like that's an ancient apologetic for reconciling Genesis 1 with Genesis chapter 2.
But on this, I just want to throw this out there because even if I see two things going on here, all right. One is more believable to me than the other. That is that wisdom in the Old Testament, which is obviously a hugely important theme in the poetic literature, especially.
Yeah.
Is frequently presented as a woman, and so I'm very much open to the idea that this wasn't just a what was the term you used, Wayne? A personification, basically, which is the Christian way of presenting it, but that she really was a goddess, that she was the queen of heaven, and she was Asherah. That all seems very reasonable to me. I'm completely open to that. But this idea that, but I see her as a consort then to Yahweh. I'm much more leaning in that direction. The idea that this is a female aspect of Yahweh is very different. And so I question that part, and so any talk about Yahweh giving birth, and Adam was created in the image of God as male and female, so that means that Yahweh was male and female. All of that I could easily throw out and say I don't see it at all, and it wouldn't take away from the idea that wisdom was a real goddess that was worshipped as a consort to Yahweh. Do you follow me?
Yeah. One thing about the claim that she's been cherry picking. Like, she quotes a lot from the book of Sirach about wisdom. And Sirach does have some passages that, even more than Proverbs, look like they could be taken as describing a god. But I don't see them as being based on that. I think they're just the extent that the writer wanted to describe wisdom, in detail and descriptive. But at the beginning of the book of Sirach, where he introduces what he's talking about, he identifies wisdom with the books of Moses, with the Torah.
Could you repeat that last part at the beginning of Sirach?
Yeah, the first chapter of Sirach, Sirach identifies wisdom with the books of Moses.
Oh,
Right,
okay.
which is precisely what Ms. Barker is saying is, alien to the post-Deuteronomic reforms. I can't say that frickin' word, Deuteronomic.
I have trouble with that same word too, but just pronounce Deuteronomy, but just put an ick instead of a me.
Deuteronomic.
Deuteronomic. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
I also changed the syllable that I stress on that. Deuteronomic instead of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomic.
But there's also a different word that came up when we were reading the Bible Unearthed. Deuteronomistic.
Yeah.
Is a different word.
Don't.
Or Deuteronomistic. I remember how you pronounce it, but yeah.
But as Liam points out, that was an important part of Barker's point of view, is that there's this. She thinks that there was a switch going on, that the emphasis on wisdom was pulled out, and the law was put in its place as a foreign thing.
Yeah, I'm not buying that. The passage she quotes from Deuteronomy to support that, I think it's Deuteronomy 6 something, or it's either 4:6 or 6:4 or something. It's around that area. I looked at that passage up, but I do not get what she's saying. I mean, the Torah is wisdom. It's not replacing. There's no concept of it replacing in that passage.
What do you guys think about the Garden of Eden thing? Like, Asherah, we know that there was some association with the Asherahs in the tree. Either it was carved from a tree or an idol set under a tree. And then the connection between the Asherah and wisdom, right? And then the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden. And Adam and Eve eat from this tree, and they gain wisdom, and they become like gods, which there are several passages, I forget where wisdom is described as like giving eternal life and kind of making you into a divinity, which is kind of what the Garden of Eden story is in a way.
There was one suggestion that Barker made that really struck me as being fascinating and something I may want to think more about later, that in the original story for the Garden of Eden, that there's probably only one tree that gave both knowledge and life. And I'm actually very tempted to agree with her on that, but I have to think about it more. But that seems really fascinating to me, that suggestion.
I have to say that just in passing, when I read that line, I did make that same mental note, so that's interesting.
The other thing I'll say about trees and stuff and the garden and stuff is there's a belief among scholars that the Garden of Eden is actually modeled after the Jewish temple. And part of it is that in the temple, they except like the cherubim and stuff in the holies of holies, there really weren't allowed to be any imagery of living things. So no gods, no man, no animals. But for decoration, then it was just full of imagery of plants and stuff. They didn't really consider plants to be living things in the same kind of sense. So basically, if you go look at the temple walls and stuff, if you go back in time and look at them, you see just all kinds of grapevines and trees and stuff. The entire thing would be decorated with flowers and that kind of thing. So it basically looks like you're in, with the reliefs on the wall, it's like you're actually in a garden.
I've read that sort of thing as well, Wayne, and I tend to lean in that direction as well. And I think we may have even compared notes once on a woman. I wish I could remember her name. It sounded like a long Greek name. Where
I know who you're talking about, yeah.
Yeah.
I forgot her name, but yeah.
She basically presented the idea, and it would fit Margaret Barker's case here, that from the perspective of these reformers who had a bias against wisdom, they're basically explaining in the Garden of Eden story and the fall, they're actually explaining why it is that Israel was sent into exile in Babylon, because here they are enjoying worship in the temple in the Garden of Eden, and then it's because that God forbade the eating of the tree of wisdom, basically, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Because they did that, because they worshipped wisdom, that's the reason why Israel's sent off into exile. They're kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Mm-hmm. And so from that perspective, they're putting a bias against wisdom. That's the whole reason. You worship wisdom, you shouldn't have.
Yeah, I totally buy her connection between the Shekinah, the Asherah, the Queen of Heaven, and wisdom. I think there's a real connection between all those things.
Yeah, but
I'm not buying it 3 ways.
Do you buy it? Do you buy it? Do you buy that concept connected with the angel of Yahweh in the context of what's coming next, which is Jesus, though?
Well, that case I'm not as sold on because it was just such a crazy chapter.
That's why
there's so much to it.
I said earlier, I think she makes a really, really good review of the wisdom tradition, but I don't think I don't know how it connects to the angel of Yahweh.
Yeah,
Same here,
I mean, there's so much stuff about wisdom, like it's said to create and being at the side of Yahweh during creation. I don't think it's just merely a personification. I think it's a real entity, like a real divinity in the thing. And then with the Canaanite connection, with the Elot being the female version of El and having the 70 sons, I mean, that just sounds too close to what we have in Genesis or in Deuteronomy, wherever the 70 sons thing is.
Can you point out, Doug, where that's at, that idea that El had a female aspect? Because I question that, but where does she say that again?
I didn't put it where it was in my notes. It's just in my notes. Let me find it. If anyone has the digital version, they could just search for, I think it's probably the only occurrence of it, Elot, E-L-A-T,
because
or Atirot.
Because it's easy to believe that El had a consort. You know, she was his consort, but to say that she was a female aspect...
Yeah, she might be taking that for granted. That's true.
Yeah,
I'm
strongly
convinced.
convinced.
One of her interpretations.
I'm strongly convinced that. Actually, I'm not sure whether I want to say El or Yahweh in this context. So I'll just say God. That the Old Testament God at some stage of history had a female consort named as Asherah. I'm fairly convinced of that, but I'm not convinced that what she's talking about with the wisdom stuff actually connects to that in any way. I do see the stuff, that could be taken as God-like about wisdom, but I'm not seeing it as looking as if it had an earlier understanding in its, in its evolution of the text. The text seems to be written just out of whole cloth with only wisdom in mind.
And what did you think about a lot? She quotes a lot from the wisdom literature, and a lot of the stuff like Baruch, and it's lamenting the abandoning of wisdom, right? A lot of the things she quotes are like, oh, the people kicked out wisdom from the temple or whatever, and then she's going through the streets and preaching, and no one will believe her, and Israel's abandoned wisdom and all this stuff like that. And she makes the connection to what this literature is talking about. It's the other side of the fence of the Deuteronomistic reformers who did try and get rid of that aspect of it, and this vein of literature is the other side of the stories, lamenting that happening. You didn't buy that there, or what did you think of it, or all you guys?
That might actually be the best part of her case here, if that's correct, but I'm not really...
I know, there's so much, it's hard to remember every little thing. I found myself very convinced by all the connections she made in chapter 4, but like I said, I can't quote to you the exact places. I should write down on what pages I write for all these notes. Sorry, I'll do that in the future.
On that point that you're making, Doug, I can't help but be influenced by one thing that impacts me more than anything is Jeremiah 44, where he's talking about, he's basically making a connection between the lack, when they stopped worshiping the Queen of Heaven, that's why they went into exile. And this is Jeremiah, sorry, 44:7. I think it's 17 and 18. But he says, but we will do everything that we have vowed, make offerings to the Queen of Heaven, and pour out drink offerings to her, as we did, both we and our fathers, our kings and our officials, in the cities of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem. For then we had plenty of food and prospered and saw no disaster. In other words, they're blessed while they worship her. And then it says, since we left off making offerings to the Queen of Heaven and pouring out drink offerings to her, we have lacked everything and have been consumed by the sword and by famine. Unless I'm on the face of it, if this is what Jeremiah is saying, unless he's quoting somebody else. But this seems to me that completely supports her case.
Yeah, that's one of them I color-coded in green. I agree with her on the Jeremiah passage.
Another one I thought was interesting is the bottom of page 52, talking about this Deuteronomists versus the wisdom people. Those who made Yahweh one also removed Asherah and all, bottom of page 52, middle of the paragraph, also removed all associated with her. It is a curious fact that Asherah is only associated with Baal in text influenced by the Deuteronomic reformers. In the extra-biblical Hebrew evidence, such as it is, Asherah is always linked with Yahweh, and in Canaanite texts of the first millennium, she is never linked to Baal. This has led some scholars to suggest that the Deuteronomists linked Asherah and Baal in order to discredit both together.
That I do find convincing.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I agree with that.
It is interesting that there's that disparity there. There's never a link between Asherah and Baal, except in the extra biblical stuff, which is interesting. And then the same thing with the Canaanite literature. She's only linked to El, never Baal. Which, remember, El is Elohim in we have, and then Baal is, I guess, the equivalent of Yahweh, right? Yahweh would be like Baal, son of El, one of the sons of El.
I found that problematic because that means that the linkage of Asherah and Baal did not come from Canaanite influences. So I don't know what to make of that.
Well, what confused? Yeah, you're right. What confused me there too is like it seems like, and she talked about it in the last readings we did, was this kind of melding of El and Yahweh. So maybe that's what's going on there. I don't know. I'm just guessing. That because I do find I think the Atarat thing in the Ugaritic literature is the equivalent of Asherah. Now, whether or not she's just giving us her interpretation that this figure was the female form of El, like Dale said, he wants to see that. I'm trying to find the darn thing. I know she doesn't say anything more about it. She doesn't quote that Ugaritic literature. But it may just be her
rather than
interpretation.
Baal, right?
Sorry?
She was interpreting as being related to El, but not Baal.
Right, exactly. And she's saying that she thinks like the Deuteronomic reformers were intentionally linking Asherah to Baal in order to make them both like into baddies, basically. They're both bad because we all know Baal is bad and Asherah is associated with Baal, so now we should throw Asherah out of the temple too. And Baal obviously is bad because he's Canaanite, which at that point in time, I guess there was enough separation there where he was just another pagan deity.
By the way, I do want to throw this out there too. It's something actually she doesn't talk about, or it doesn't. Anyway, she doesn't say anything about it, but I personally can't help but see. I, for a long time, have been thinking that how much the Jews were influenced by Egyptian religion to some extent. And I couldn't help but think of the goddess Isis when we were talking about Asherah. And the reason why I bring her up now is because the same sort of loosey-goosey stuff that we see, I mean, often this stuff, as we talked about, is hard to get your hands on because sometimes she looks like she's the consort of Yahweh, sometimes the consort of El. But the fact is, I see this with Egyptian, the goddess of Isis. She was the consort of Osiris. All right, she's the wife of Osiris, and they have a son, Horus. But later on, she's actually the consort of Horus, the sun. And so that sort of looseness, that sort of like inconsistency to some extent, is parallel to what we see going on here with Asherah.
So yeah, it wouldn't be inconceivable that this inconsistency would appear. Yeah, I see that.
Was it in the Great Angel because I might have read this in an earlier book, but she mentions the fact that, like, the Garden of Eden story is not referenced in any other part of the Old Testament. And she offered kind of like two interpretations of that. One was that it was the temple theology that went underground and fed into the wisdom literature and so forth as an alternative type of thing, or it was a later composition and therefore just wasn't, known because it didn't exist yet. And most of the scholarship favors the latter. So if you oppose that and take on her side of it, then it's not so much going against scholarship, but you're seeing that older stuff where it might not have even been that old. It might be all just newer developments of equating wisdom with some kind of powerful force or divinity.
I thought her claim actually was that Moses wasn't mentioned in like the earlier stratums of the rest of the Old Testament literature. I forget the term she used for stratums, but the Garden of Eden specifically is mentioned in Ezekiel, but Ezekiel's probably a later stage.
Oh, you mean the prophetic literature, like the prophets, right?
Well, there's different, there's the three Isaiahs. The first one was it pre-exile, maybe pre-exilic is what she meant.
Yeah,
so
right. Pre-exilic prophets don't have any
reference to Moses.
Right, or any thing to do with Moses. Yeah.
Yeah.
At least that's what she had claimed earlier on in this book.
I need a method of checking that. But.
And that's a legitimate, that's a legitimate Old Testament problem,
Mm-hmm. There's one other thing I highlighted on 58 at the bottom, the last paragraph, which I thought was interesting. I want to know what you guys thought more about this link between the Asherah and trees and wisdom in Asherah and the tree in the garden giving wisdom. But anyway, before that, I wanted to read the bottom paragraph 58. It says, "The tree symbol was one of the significant transformations in the wake of the Reform. The trees of the Garden of Eden, I suggest, had once been those of the older cult, just as the garden had itself formerly been the heavenly garden of the gods. The fruit of the tree, originally there had been but one," yeah, that's what you were talking about, Wayne, one tree, "gave knowledge and life, and the serpent spoke well to Eve when he," and remember, knowledge and life is exactly what wisdom is said to give, not just life, like mortal life, but eternal life, which is what the tree of life gives in the Garden of Eden. If you keep eating it, you don't die. Gave knowledge and life, and the serpent spoke well to Eve when he said that the fruit would open their eyes and make them like the Elohim, like gods. This is the original role of the heavenly knowledge. It transformed the human into the divine and thus gave life, which was not subject to mortality. The Yahweh of the Reformers evicted the dangerous pair from the garden once they had acquired knowledge so that they would not also acquire life. Blah, 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 blah. So yeah, did you guys find that convincing at all, that this is like, the whole Garden of Eden story is like the story of the Deuteronomists saying, like, it's a representation of kicking out wisdom from the theology?
Maybe I'll try to reword that and see if I'm saying the same thing that you and her were saying. The idea that trying to get wisdom was a sin, which is described in Genesis 3. Mm-hmm. Is that supposedly connected to belief in like the older theology, with Asherah whatever was a sin? Is that what you're trying to say? That the Deuteronomists, didn't like that particular, beliefs about wisdom, so, it's like that brings death if you believe that?
It seems like that's what she's saying, that the story is constructed in this way, that trying to access knowledge through the eating of the fruit in this case was a mistake, and it's the Deuteronomists presenting it this way. I think that's what she's arguing. And that this is like a metaphorical polemic against the other Israelites who do like worship wisdom and try and go after wisdom and all that.
Doug is just talking about the very thing we just discussed with the. You remember that Greek woman again, Wayne, that we were talking about, and her case.
Yeah, I looked up her name. It is Francesca Stavrakopoulou.
Yeah.
I'm not pronouncing it right, but something like that.
So she's saying it's because they worshipped wisdom that they were kicked out of the garden. In other words, kicked out of Israel and sent into exile in Babylon. I think that's realistic. I find that convincing to me, or at least I don't find that hard to swallow. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. I guess the connection that I'm not following here is that wisdom itself was ever thought of as a deity, or that the description of wisdom arose from descriptions of a deity. That's what I'm not following. Her stuff about Asherah, I do follow. Her stuff about the Queen of Heaven, I do follow. Even the passages where they're talking about, wisdom no longer dwells here and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I follow her there with caveats that I'm still not convinced that wisdom was meant to refer to a deity. It may refer to some other part of the theology, like maybe a Gnostic tendency or something to the theology, even at that early stage.
I could see just taking on your objection that maybe there was this synchronization and timing between like kicking out Asherah and rejection of wisdom, if indeed there is one that's actually that close in time. That maybe they just threw them both out, that they weren't the same thing necessarily. There was Asherah, the Queen of Heaven, the consort of El, and then there was this other thing, wisdom, which wasn't necessarily a goddess and wasn't really even necessarily Asherah, just some, I don't know what you'd call it. Whatever you call it.
Yeah, I find that a step more plausible, I think.
Yeah, so that they just kicked them both out.
Yeah.
At once, that was part of the general reform, not that they were the same thing.
But like I said, my issue is that I'm just not seeing evidence to make the connection between wisdom and a deity. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm missing that in your description here.
When I read the book of Proverbs, it's not difficult for me to see that this is a real figure, a real deity that's being described.
I see it as an extension of God Himself in ways, but yeah.
Well, I guess I just feel like at least now, it feels like special pleading to try to say, oh, it's only a personification, that there's no real person speaking as wisdom, even though the book of Proverbs is talking about what wisdom is a woman, and she goes out, she tries to draw people to her, and it says that Proverbs 9, that she was involved with, she worked along with God to create the heavens and the earth. So,
but in Proverbs, the opposite of wisdom is folly, and there's a lot discussed in there about the dangers of folly. The remedy for folly is education and teaching and meditation. There's nothing there to suggest that it's talking about a deity.
The one other thing that I found, none of these are clinchers to me. I think she's trying to make a cumulative case where none of them, no individual thing will be like, oh yeah, that just solves it. But to me, I thought she was trying to build a cumulative case. But anyway, one of the other things I liked in regards to this wisdom thing was, and this is a little bit of a stretch as far as the etymology of this word, but you'll see where I find it convincing toward the end. This is on page 57, and this is in 1st Enoch, and in the Ethiopic version, there's the archangel who, let's see, with the name Israel. The other Greek version has Uriel, and the Ethiopic is not clear. It has been suggested that Israel, in the Semitic original, will have been Istarel. And Ishtar, as we have seen, was the goddess of wisdom. This is the Babylonian goddess. In the Babylonian version of the flood story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which obviously Israelites were borrowing from, that whole literature, or mythology, whatever. It was this goddess Ishtar who was especially concerned with the fate of mankind at the Great Flood, and her lament is recorded, and this is from the epic. Then Ishtar, the sweet-voiced queen of heaven, cried out like a woman in travail, blah, 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 blah. So there Ishtar is being linked. She's the goddess of wisdom and also is called the queen of heaven, which is what I think some of you guys were saying, well, yeah, maybe Asherah is the queen of heaven, but not necessarily the wisdom thing. So I thought that was one more little bit that, admittedly, it's a stretch, but I thought it was interesting. Do you guys have any thoughts on that little part?
I wanted to go back to an earlier point.
Oh, go for it.
We were talking about the Garden of Eden scene in Genesis, and one other issue I have with that is I think that's a story that was borrowed from like the Babylonians and just kind of edited to make it fit better with the Hebrew theology and stuff. But I think the basic concepts there, being kicked out of the garden and the tree, and the serpent and stuff. I think those are all just borrowed elements from a previous myth. That's as old, if not older, than like the Gilgamesh epic.
Like from the New Malish story with what's his name, the hunter losing his innocence.
I'm not familiar enough with the Enuma Elish, but
her wisdom.
It has elements of being a borrowed story, especially in the ways that there are elements in the story that aren't explained adequately. It's like, and that usually happens when you're borrowing from another story, but don't want to place too much emphasis on things that don't fit well with your own theology. So, like the identification of the serpent is not really explained in Genesis. It's just there, and he's able to speak. He has knowledge of what the tree's about and stuff, but how he got that knowledge is never explained. And I think that's because it was taken from another tradition where those things were explained, but the explanation was not included when it was borrowed.
I would, if I may, I would add to that. I agree with what Wayne just said, but I think also that her wisdom interpretation of the Eden story, that kind of thing, is the reason why the Mormons take to her like they do. It's because it plays right into their theological kind of interpretation of Genesis and the creation story.
I thought
where the serpent, like you just said, the serpent is not really identified as even a foe or an adversary, really.
Yeah. I think one reason she's popular with Mormons is that, first of all, the idea that there can actually be many Old Testament deities in a way, but also the idea that mankind can actually become God in a sense is a kind of a Mormon idea that she talks about a lot in here. Theosis, that's the term for it.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, Wayne, when you were talking about this idea that perhaps they inherited these stories in Babylon, perhaps, the Garden of Eden imagery and so forth, even if that's the case, it seems to me that if what they're trying to say is, even if they're using Babylonian imagery, it seems to me they're saying, this is the reason why you were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, because you took the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In other words, wisdom, whatever she is, even if this is a Babylonian idea, wisdom is something that you partook of, and it was forbidden by God. You partook of it before you went into the exile. So even if they're using this other image, even if they borrow the imagery later on, the point that they're trying to say is Israel worshipped wisdom before the exile, and that's the reason for the exile. Even if you see what I'm saying? Even if they borrow the imagery later, it's still making this point that she wants to make. It doesn't hurt her case, as far as I can see.
You might be right about that.
The other little thought I had, I think it's in Isaiah where, or maybe it's in Jeremiah, I forget, but I think it's Isaiah where, and Dr. Price has quoted this passage a lot as one of the humorous parts of the Bible, where it's describing this guy who's cut down a tree, and out of half the tree he carves an idol, and the other half he uses firewood to cook his dinner. Is that from Isaiah? Do you guys remember?
It is. I think it's second Isaiah. We read it last week.
Yeah.
After we went offline.
It made me think. Could given that it's a tree, could the Isaiah there be describing the making of an Asherah? Just a random thought.
That's possible. Let me actually read this little bit that, although I apologize, I looked it up, just wanted to see the connection between the tree, to Asherah, and particularly the expression, some translations talk about the sacred pole, that was worshipped in the high places. And believe it or not, this is from the Jehovah's Witnesses, and at least some of you know I was a former witness, so don't think I looked for it just because it was from the witnesses. It just so happened it came up on the internet. But anyway, and don't discount it possibly for that reason. But it says, anyway, the Hebrew word Asherah is thought to refer to, one, a sacred pole representing Asherah, a Canaanite goddess of fertility, and two, the goddess Asher herself. However, it's not always possible to determine whether a particular scripture is to be understood as referring to the idolatrous object or to the goddess. A number of modern Bible translations, though, have rendered the original language word as sacred pole or post, but transliterated it when the reference is apparently to the goddess. Others have not endeavored to make a distinction, but have simply transliterated the Hebrew word, or have consistently translated it sacred poles. In the older translations of the Bible, the Hebrew word has usually been rendered as groves, but this rendering is inappropriate in such texts as... Anyway, this one other point. The sacred poles apparently stood upright and were made of wood, or at least contained wood, the Israelite being commanded to cut them down and to burn them. They may have simply been uncarved poles, perhaps even trees in some instances, for God's people were instructed, you must not plant for yourself any sort of tree as a sacred pole, Deuteronomy 16:21. So I think there's merit in there to say that that trees themselves, I think that's a part of her case, is that trees were connected with Asherah worship, and that would support her case of the meaning behind the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life in the garden.
Yeah.
To me, that's... Go ahead, Wayne.
You go ahead.
I was just going to say, I agree that these links are not like ballpark, they're not knockdown cases. To me, I think the link between Asherah and wisdom is mainly in that Garden of Eden link. That Asherah is definitely associated with the tree, and then wisdom is definitely giving life and knowledge, and was at the side of at Yahweh's side during his creating and all the great works of Yahweh. To me, that's the link in the Garden of Eden. But again, it's not a strong one. I'm just saying I think it's plausible on that basis. But then also the link between in First Enoch, the Ethiopic version, and Ishtar being one of her titles was the Queen of Heaven, and she was a goddess of wisdom. And then again, I'm gonna have to look more into this. The Atarat thing in the Canaanite theology or mythology, being the female form of El, not just a entirely separate deity. If that's true, and remember we're getting this from Barker, so it might be one of a mistaken interpretation by her. But if that's true, I think that would play in her favor. So anyway, that's just where I'm coming from on this whole issue between the linking of Asherah and wisdom. I think Shekinah, that seems to be like the later Kabbalah type stuff from what I was reading. But
it's in Exodus.
Oh, it is?
Yeah, Shekinah is in Exodus. Yeah.
Where's that at?
I don't remember exactly the way, but it's used in the description of the pillar of fire and the smoke that followed them when they're on the Exodus.
Oh, that's right. And we'll get into this later on the angelology, because that the great angel, or some of the angels, were described too as like pillars of cloud or fire. So anyway.
And I want to mention something else.
Those things taken all together make the theory at least plausible to me. So that's just my opinion on the whole.
Regarding the Garden of Eden thing again, I know we've been discussing that almost to death, but I don't really buy this suggestion, and not just by Barker, but other scholars have also meant this suggestion that it's that it's meant to represent the exile, or the loss of the temple and stuff. I'm just not really seeing that in Genesis. It's a description. It's an etymological myth about the human condition. About why women have pains in childbirth and things. Why human males don't have a bone in their penis the way other animals do. Why we have to toil with weeds and stuff all the time. And the garden part of it and the paradise part of it seems to just be, taking the blame off of God. That they were created in a better environment. God didn't create it in this bad thing, in this bad situation, but they brought it upon themselves. So it's a way to get to the human condition from a place of God created them, not necessarily in that condition. But I don't see anything, it's about humanity in general. I don't see anything necessarily about the exile there.
Yeah, I just thought her interpretation was interesting, but yeah. And I agree, there's definitely, like, the form critical stuff I think is definitely in there. But I think the story as a whole could serve a lot of purposes.
Yeah.
But there's ideological stuff in there too, for sure. And remember, we're talking about sometimes Genesis 1, sometimes Genesis 2, so...
Yeah.
I'm reading off of Wikipedia now. This is back to Atarot. She is also called Elot, and then it gives the Ueretic form, goddess, the feminine form of El. So according to Wikipedia too, she is the feminine form of El. Atarot is.
Does the myth have to be one or the other? Can it not represent the human condition as well as the exile? And because
it can, yes, except for I don't see any evidence that was the original writer's intention. I don't see any other things there that that clue us in as the writer having the exile in mind. It rather seems to be the kind of thing that people in exile will look at this older story and then apply it to their situation retroactively. But were it written with the exile in mind, I would expect there to be more specific clues I do not see there.
Just a little side note that's of interest. This is from the wiki on Ashara. In contrast, Ashtar is believed to be linked to the Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar, who is sometimes portrayed as the daughter of Anu, while in Ugaritic myth, Ashtar is one of the daughters of El, the West Semitic counterpart of Anu. Among the Hittites, so now we've gone from the Babylonians, now we're to the Hittites up in the Turkey area. Among the Hittites, this goddess appears as Ashurdu, or Asertu, the consort of El Kunirsa, or El, the creator of Earth, and the mother of 77 or 88 sons. So there's the Hittites with this myth, again, this kind of myth theme. Then among the Amarna letters, a king of the Amorites is named Abdi Ashirta, or servant of Asherah. So this myth this formulation of this myth, like the general structure of it, seems to have just been all over the place. Anyway, interesting side note, sorry. Did you guys want to keep going on the wisdom thing or the Asherah thing?
Well, I guess I just want to ask, how's everybody doing so far? I mean, it seems to me she's building a case in which she's basically saying that the first temple traditions were not just polytheistic, but polytheistic in this specific great angel way, in that the Deuteronomic reforms kind of made it obsolete somehow, or tried to, but then eventually when Christianity came along, they kind of took up the torch again. And that seems to be the case she's making. Am I reading too much into that?
I don't think she's saying that they were taking up the torch again so much as that people who held this point of view were always there. They just aren't. It's just that the collection of scripture that we have isn't really reflecting that.
That's what I would say too, and I tend to think, at least my current working theory is that that the Essene community basically held on to this view, and Christians happen to be one group that were influenced, if not were themselves Essenes. So in other words, there were groups that had different perspectives. I think, Leon, you and I specifically talked about the idea that the reformers had the Sadducean theology, basically, when they went into exile. But those that were influenced by the Persians were the Pharisees, and then the Essenes were actually the pre-exilic tradition carried on. So I think these three versions of Judaism carry on these three different traditions.
Well, I had to ask so that we're kind of all on the same page, so to speak, because before we started, Wayne had expressed how, well, we were just talking in general about how it's kind of a hard book to read because it doesn't seem to be, like I said before, I think to me it seems like a midrash, like a personal midrash, a highly developed one and a highly conversant one and a highly well-informed one, but it is a midrash.
Well, I think the valuable parts are, for instance, when she's talking about the synchronicity and how different aspects of these deities are blending and separating apart. That to me is interesting, but regardless of her biases, it doesn't affect a lot of her analysis. That's what I enjoy about it, is that I'm learning a lot, even if I don't particularly agree with everything she's saying.
Yeah, I'm with that. I'm actually really, really impressed with her range.
I have to admit that after last week's Hangout, I spent a couple hours watching videos from her on YouTube, not really about this book, but on other topics and stuff, and they really turned me off to her. Like what she was saying about the book of Revelation and in some of her talks, just comparing that to how strongly convinced I was by the Parables of War and John Marshall that we read. And I just don't find her views on Revelation convincing at all. I just think she's just flying blind on it. And it just, I don't know, it didn't make me want to trust her that much on anything she writes after listening to her for several hours on YouTube.
In some of those videos, it's if you don't accept her earlier work, then that stuff doesn't make a convincing case. In other words, you almost already have to have gone with her that far in order to go with her the distance.
Yeah, that might be it.
One other interesting thing, if her thesis is true, like she mentions this thing in Proverbs, let not loyalty and faithfulness forsake you, bind them to your neck, write them upon the tablet of your heart. My son, keep your father's commandments, and forsake not your mother's teaching. Bind them upon your heart always, tie them about your neck. When you walk, they will lead you, blah, blah, blah. There's this thing from Deuteronomy that a lot of Jews take, that, you know, tefillin, they have that thing on their head and they wrap a string around their arm.
And the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4, usually.
Yeah, exactly. I'm wondering, like, if they're actually unwittingly putting a sign of of the goddess Asherah on their arm and head. Because if Deuteronomy's getting this from Proverbs. Anyway, just a little.
Phylacteries?
Yeah.
By the way, I do want to bring up something else that she said, which she makes a connection between wisdom and the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
What did you guys think of that connection?
I, again, thought it was not utterly convincing, but I thought it was quite plausible, and I'm willing to go with her on it.
I know a lot of the same metaphors I use for both, but I don't necessarily believe that means there's any specific sort of connection between them, though. I think it's just those kind of metaphors are just popular metaphors to use.
Well, I think yeah, it's popular metaphor. It's there's a long tradition. The mystics kind of like to make that kind of a connection.
Yeah, see, I think that these people actually thought like the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, if you want to call it that, or the Spirit of wisdom was a real thing.
Yeah.
Like an entity that entered into them.
Exactly. When prophets go to speak for God, they say that God's Spirit came into them.
Right.
It could be that wisdom came into them too, because that's what the Spirit's doing for them. It's giving them this knowledge. It's giving them this message to speak about.
And I think that's her point. Like, it's basically, you're talking about the same thing. Holy Spirit, Spirit of wisdom. Really, I mean, if you were just put, instead of replace the term Spirit of wisdom or Holy Spirit and just put XXXXX there and lay out all the passages with each of the two terms, you wouldn't be able to tell them apart. Like, they're just the same.
Probably not.
Yeah.
I don't know if any of you saw the thing that I had posted on Facebook related to that point about her wisdom being the Holy Spirit, because I thought it had an interesting implication for the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. Because basically, if Jesus is Yahweh, but he's wisdom as well, and that would make him the Holy Spirit. And according to her theology, she doesn't make this explicit, but it seemed like the natural outgrowth of what the case that she's made is, if Yahweh had a male and a female aspect, and wisdom is the female aspect, so Yahweh is the male and wisdom, or the Holy Spirit is the female aspect, then Jesus encompasses both the male and female, and so two persons in the Trinity are really just two aspects of one person, and so the Trinity is really made up of two persons and not three.
I've had a similar thought, long time ago, even when I was reading Earl Doherty's book, The Jesus Puzzle. And he was convincing me, that the earliest view of Christ was just as a heavenly figure and stuff. I really think a lot of the Holy Spirit passages in the New Testament are how Jesus was portrayed in earlier Christianity. They had to be maintained, but they were kind of made into a separate thing from the Jesus who was historicized.
Right, it does seem like it would go well with the Christ myth theory, in a sense.
I was just thinking that while I was reading this book. Like, I just jumped in, I just got back, but as soon as you said it would fit in with the Christ myth theory, I'm assuming you're talking about her ideas, right?
Wasn't there an article that McGrath wrote, something to that effect, that Christ myth theorists kind of like Barker, Great Angel, and other works?
What I was talking about is that the Christ myths postulate a version of Jesus before he was viewed as a man as just being a spiritual being only and stuff. And the way that he related to the church and things, giving them, visions and things, those things were kept, but when he was made into, an incarnated person as a human being and stuff, they ended up being, since he was changed, those other things stayed the same. So like Jesus on two different trajectories. one of them became the Holy Spirit in the New Testament. The other one became, the ascended Christ. Kind of,
Yeah, there was one other thing. Maybe someone, if they have a digital version, can help me. But where they're talking about the Spirit on the face of the waters in Genesis. If they can just search for like breath, I can't find it. Does anyone have a digital version in here?
The breath of God fluttered over the waters. Yeah.
Yeah.
The Spirit of God
What page is that on?
I don't remember it being in this book. So.
It was in
Maybe
passing.
page 62.
62. There was one thing that I thought was.
Yeah, there it is. Last paragraph.
Yeah. Elsewhere in the Old Testament, the creative power is not wisdom, but the Spirit of God moving on the face of the waters, or the Spirit of God which made man. It was the Spirit that transformed dust into living beings. When Yahweh sent forth His Spirit, all things were created, or they were recreated, in Isaiah. This was the breath of God. Yet Sirach 24 says wisdom was the breath of Elyon, and describes her as the creator in language reminiscent of Isaiah, and this is from Isaiah. I came forth from the mouth of the Most High, and covered the earth like a mist. I dwelt in high places, and my throne was a pillar of cloud. Alone I made the circuit of the vault of heaven, and I walked in the depths of the abyss. I'm sorry, that's from
Sirach chapter 24.
That's from Sirach, yeah.
Read that entire chapter, because when she only quotes a couple verses of it, it doesn't really give you the big picture of what's being said in Sirach. Read the entire chapter and look at it as a whole, not
so
just
the context might
not just what she cherry picks from it.
Okay. I will do that. The whole chapter, Sirach 24.
Yeah.
I could read it right now.
Yeah, you could.
Long? Is it really long?
It's not too bad.
It's 34 verses.
Oh, you can if you want.
What are we reading?
Sirach 24. Yeah, it's pretty short. Someone can read it. You want to read it, John?
Okay.
Why are we reading?
To get the context of this quote, because this is describing the wisdom or the Spirit of God in terminology similar to what's going on in Genesis with the breath of God hovering over the waters and all that.
But can I suggest that we read one other thing first, so I can find where it is here?
While you're finding that way, the other thing too is like in Wisdom of Solomon, the quote, "For wisdom, the fashion of all things taught me." So wisdom's being linked with creative abilities, a creator, and remember that's what Jesus basically is, right? Like he's the Logos who created. Isn't that right? Like Philo, the Logos, and Philo is the pre-existent creator.
Yes, I think so.
Well, the first thing I thought of was the Gospel of John, where it says that through him all things were made.
Right, and then John picks up on Philo. Yeah, exactly. Or at least I'm assuming that's the directionality. I guess some people have argued that John is like the earliest gospel, but I don't see that.
Well, parts of it definitely aren't, for sure.
Yeah.
You know, could be some stuff that's old.
Yeah, that's what I'm torn on, John. Like, part of it seems old, like you said. Like, if you're taking the Christ myth theory, if it's true, a lot of it seems like, wow, this could be a really early form of Christianity. But then other stuff, like we've talked to Dr. Price about, is obviously correcting, or meant to give an opposing view of Jesus in comparison to the Synoptics. So maybe it's
tone it down a little bit. The Christology seems to get too high, and then it's brought down a notch.
Mm-hmm. Um,
I noticed that the NSRV translation of Sirach is slightly different. I like the RSV version better, the one that she's directly quoting from, so I think I'll read that version when we get around to it.
I can't find what I was looking for. I thought in Sirach chapter 1 is where it associated it with the books of Moses, but I must be talking and thinking of chapter 1 of a different book. 'Cause I'm not seeing it here again. But it does talk more about wisdom in chapter 1, and it connects with chapter 24. But I don't know if we want to take the time to read both of them now. Probably not.
it's up to you guys. I don't mind doing all of Sirach 24 if you want to.
Let's read the whole book. Yeah, I was just doing a quick search of Sirach for wisdom to see if I could spot what Wayne was talking about.
Search for Moses, but I don't think it's there. I thought it was chapter 1 of one of these texts that Barker mentions, but I'm not seeing it now.
John, were you going to read that for us, chapter 24?
Yeah, if Wayne's done.
Yeah, I'm done.
Okay. All right. Wisdom will praise herself and will glory in the midst of her people. In the assembly of the Most High she will open her mouth, and in the presence of his host she will glory. I came forth from the mouth of the Most High and covered the earth like mist. This is the part she quotes, I think, right? I dwelt in high places, and my throne was in a pillar of cloud. Alone I have made the circuit of the vault of heaven, and have walked in the depths of the abyss. In the waves of the sea, in the whole earth, and in every people and nation, I have gotten a possession. Among all these I sought a resting place. I sought in whose territory I might lodge. Quote, then the Creator of all things gave me a commandment, and the one who created me assigned a place for my tent. And he said, make your dwelling in Jacob, and in Israel receive your inheritance.
Can I stop you there?
Yeah.
That whole section there is describing how hard she's looking for a place to rest. So the reason it's describing heaven, the reason it's describing Sheol, is just because, of how vast she's searching for a place. And then she finally is told to settle in Jacob. So I wouldn't take those metaphors that refer to heaven and stuff too literally as she being a goddess or anything. I would take them as just being the extent of her search for her home.
And she's doing it alone, not necessarily that she's a lone goddess.
Yeah.
Apart and separate. Yeah, I could see.
So it's almost like a lament, yeah. Like, where can I rest my head, kind of thing. Right?
Yep.
Well, let's go on because we'll see if that holds up. Verse 9. From eternity, in the beginning, he created me, and for eternity I shall not cease to exist. In the holy tabernacle I ministered before him, and so I was established in Zion. In the beloved city likewise he gave me a resting place, and in Jerusalem was my dominion. So I took root in an honored people, in the portion of the Lord, who is their inheritance. I grew tall like a cedar in Lebanon, and like a cypress on the heights of Hermann. I grew tall like a palm tree in En-Gedi, and like rose plants in Jericho, like a beautiful olive tree in the field, and like a plane tree I grew tall.
Hold on. Notice all the tree imagery there?
Yes, there's a lot of tree imagery there. They're not all trees. Some of them are vines and spices and flowers and stuff. Also.
True.
Which some people say that was part of the decorations of the temple. I think Wayne mentioned, wall decorations. There also could have been like plants and stuff, palm trees and things like that, physically in the temple. 15. Like cassia and camel's thorn I gave forth the aroma of spices, and like choice myrrh I spread a pleasant odor. Like galbanum, anica, and stecti, and like the fragrance of frankincense in the tabernacle. Like a terebinth, which is also, I think, trees, yeah. I spread out my branches, and my branches are glorious and graceful. Like a vine, I caused loveliness to bud, and my blossoms became glorious and abundant fruit. Quote, come to me, you who desire me, and eat your fill of my produce. For the remembrance of me is sweeter than honey, and my inheritance sweeter than the honeycomb. Those who eat me will hunger for more, and those who drink me will thirst for more. Whoever obeys me will not be put to shame, and those who work with my help will not sin.
I want to stop there just to mention that I think the Last Supper and the Eucharist, the saying of Jesus, this bread is, my body, and the wine is my blood and stuff. I think there's actually a shadow of this passage in that, and it may be part of the inspiration for the New Testament passage.
And not only that,
Why
it's
they wanted
just,
to cut it out in the Reformation.
to me, some of these passages too are just glaring of the Garden of Eden story, like eat of my fruit, all that stuff. Those who eat of me will hunger still. Those who drink of me, come to me, all who desire me, and be filled with my fruits. Anyway, sorry. There's a lot in here.
We're almost done.
Well, this is the verse I'm looking for.
23. All this is the book of the covenant. All this I thought it said in. All this is the book of the covenant of the Most High God, the law which Moses commanded us.
Okay, I thought that was chapter 1, but it's actually this chapter 24 there, is where she associates it with the Torah.
As an inheritance for the congregations of Jacob. It fills men with wisdom like the Pishon, and like the Tigris at the time of the first fruits. That's got to be a reference to Eden, right? It makes them full of understanding like the Euphrates and like the Jordan at harvest time. It makes instruction shine forth like light, like the Gihon at the time of vintage. Just as the first man did not know her perfectly, the last one has not fathomed her, for her thought is more abundant than the sea, and her counsel deeper than the great abyss. I went forth like a canal from a river, and like a water channel into a garden. I said, quote, I will water my orchard and drench my garden plot, unquote. And lo, my canal became a river, and my river became a sea. I will again make instruction shine forth like the dawn, and I will make it shine afar. I will again pour out teaching like prophecy, and leave it to all future generations. Observe that I have not labored for myself alone, but for all who seek instruction.
Thank you, John. Yeah, definitely echoes of Genesis in here. With the mentioning of the same 4 rivers that Genesis does, and mentioning that there's man here, that's beyond dispute that this has Genesis in mind.
I agree. And also, I was going to point out one other thing that came to my mind while we were reading that. The description of wisdom in Proverbs 8, where it talks about wisdom being part of a workman that worked with God to create, so in other words, wisdom is the co-creator. But it's interesting to me that Proverbs 8:22 says, the Lord begot me, the firstborn of his ways, the forerunner of his prodigies of long ago. All right. Depends on what translation you get. Some indicate the Lord possessed me, but several translations say he brought me forth, he begot me. The reason why that's important to me is because Wayne is talking about the idea that we're talking about a personification, just wisdom in general, but personified as a woman. But this idea that God created wisdom takes it out of the realm of his own wisdom. If it's just wisdom in general, then wisdom existed as long as the Creator existed.
But remember who's creating. She comes out of the mouth of the Most High, El Elyon.
Now in Sirach, which we just read, it's El Elyon that does it, but in Proverbs 8, it's Yahweh that does it.
Yeah. Okay, good point. Yeah, I thought you were talking about Sirach, sorry.
But it seemed, I don't know if you see it as important as I do, in the sense that Proverbs 8 is saying there was a time when wisdom didn't exist, but Yahweh created wisdom. And to me, that's an explicit proof that we're not talking then about a personification of wisdom in general. We're talking about the goddess wisdom who was created at a certain point. It takes it out of the personification realm. Does any of you see it as I do on that?
I do not. I think it's just part of the personification. That's the most important thing, for God's creation was, His wisdom in creation, and with it.
So how is it, if that's all it means, then how is it possible that God didn't always have wisdom? I'm saying that if it's wisdom, if it's a female deity he created, that says, this passage says nothing about his own wisdom, that he is wise for all eternity. But if you want to say this is the personification of wisdom, then you have to say Yahweh or El Elyon was not always wise. Because when you say it's a personification, you're saying it's talking about his own wisdom, and there was a point when he was not, when his own wisdom didn't exist.
Yeah, I agree with that. Sorry, this is Kelly here, but anyway, this is my first meeting I've been into. Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, welcome.
But anyway, I was thinking the same thing, that the idea of God creating wisdom. If wisdom is just like an aspect of God personified, then wisdom would have existed as long as God existed. There would never have been a time where God existed and wisdom didn't exist, if wisdom is simply an aspect of God.
I think you're overthinking it more than the poet that wrote it would have.
Well, yeah, I mean, that could be right. Like, it may be in their mind, maybe, yeah, I see what you mean. They may not have thought it through logically. They just thought, well, God is the source of wisdom, so it came forth from, Yeah, that could also be, I can see it either way, I guess.
Yeah, and that just throws a wrench in a lot of this, because, I mean, a lot of this is literally poetry, so how much of it were people back in this time, like, taking it literally, or how much of it was just imagery or symbolism? It's hard to say.
I have a question, if I may, that's kind of related. Excuse me. But we need to back up a little bit for it. We were talking about how conducive Miss Barker's ideas would be to a Christmas theory. Now, given I don't know, I know Dale has read the entire book, and I don't know how far ahead you guys have read into the book. But given the fact that Philo's equation of the logos with being a metaphor similar to the wisdom of God, would you guys agree with that?
No doubt about it.
Well,
For
then
me.
does Margaret Barker go into the Alexandrian school of Hellenic Judaism, where there was a Joshua cult at all? I mean, is this part of her?
I'm guessing probably, because there's actually a chapter dealing with Philo specifically and other Jewish writers.
Okay.
From different time periods.
Okay, because that would be kind of important to this whole thread, I think.
Yeah.
I want to mention that we are already almost, how many hours into this? Almost 2 hours into this, and we haven't gotten to chapter 5 yet. But I don't have really much to say about chapter 5.
Me either.
I didn't feel like I got much out of it. So I mean, for pacing ourselves, we might be doing okay. It'll probably go pretty quickly.
Yeah. I guess that we would spend most of our time on 4, but so that's why I'm okay with spending more time on 4 than 5. But yeah, if you guys want to move, or if anyone has anything else to say,
been touching on it here and there. I mean, obliquely.
A little bit, yeah.
Does somebody want to wrap up or summarize your argument for chapter 4? Not me, because I don't think I'm doing her argument justice. I think I'm too critical of it. So, would somebody favorable to her summarize her argument?
I have a question that probably bridges the gap between 4 and 5. Some of the posts that I made in the group earlier today were all about how the angelology of Judaism seems to be, let's say, inspired by Zoroastrianism and contact with Persians. And of course, that happened maybe not even so much as during the exile as right after it, or during the very late exile for some Jews who may not have returned as early as others. So, but yet, when we look at the history of Asherah being expelled from the temple, it's long before the influence of Zoroastrianism, because it happens during the reign of Hezekiah and during the reign of Josiah. So where is this fervor for a Yahweh-only cult coming from? You know, like, why is Asherah being expelled from the temple? It's not just because everyone is being converted to angels, as, you know, per the Barker idea, because that's probably not going to happen for another 100 years or so.
I actually took it that she's arguing against that view. Like, in chapter 5, she was saying that the common scholarly view is like what you said, that they picked up this angelology from exposure to the Persian mythology, and that for within Judaism it served as like they were like a mediating term between humanity and God. The gap was becoming bigger and bigger, and she's saying that's not the right view. Like, she's saying angelology developed way earlier on, and that it was really a reimagining or kind of a demotion of the sons of God, because Yahweh now, the chief son of God, is God, and so all the other sons of God just have to become angels. That's why they all have the L at the end of their name. That's how I was reading her theory on that. I may have misread it, though.
Okay, so where is that coming from, though? This sudden need to demote everybody and turn them into angels.
I think
just an idea that they had the same as Zoroaster had.
I think in the case of Israelites, and maybe they picked this up from somewhere else, I don't know, but I think it's because for whatever reason, and this I don't know why they would do it, Yahweh basically displaced El, or got combined with El as the Most High God. And then once that happened, you can't have other sons of El who are equal to Yahweh. They have to get demoted, so they become angels. But I don't know why that happened. I don't know why Yahweh would have been kind of melded with El and became the highest pinnacle God. I don't know why that happened.
I have an idea about that that I've just been thinking about. Is that it seems like after the exile, the Jews almost had this kind of inferiority complex, like, because they had been just tossed back and forth between all these foreign powers, you know, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, Persians, and then the Greeks. And it's almost like, to compensate for that, it's like, well, okay, to rationalize it, you know, well, God's letting all these horrible things happen to us, but then this is where you get this kind of restored kingdom imagery that you see a lot in Isaiah, like the lion will lay down with the lamb and all that.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they're kind of overcompensating for how bad things have gotten by saying how good things will be in the future, and in a way they're compensating for their like political feeling of inferiority by saying, well, one day we're going to have a king that's going to rule everybody, and if we're going to rule everybody, then that must mean that our God is the God, you know.
Mm.
Like, he set the Babylonians against us. It's a rationalization. Whereas in the older view, Yahweh really had no control over Babylon. Babylon had its own God. So
You're talking about things that happened hundreds of years or within the next 100 years after the cleansing of the temple of Asherah and with the sun. All of that happened before the exile, and like I think it's the 7th century. Josiah and even before during the reign of his grandfather Hezekiah. And my question is, why was the temple cleansed of the other gods then?
Yeah, before the Persian exile. This is what you mean, right?
Exactly.
Well, it could just be maybe Josiah. Well, if you read just even on a straightforward reading of, well, I guess is it Second Kings that deals with Josiah? It's his zeal is sparked by the discovery, he must have been very young because I think he took the throne when he was 8, and it was not long after that they were restoring the temple, and they supposedly discovered the Book of the Covenant. So it could be just even on a straightforward reading that, somehow the Torah was rediscovered, which seems implausible, but that could be an explanation for why this sudden reform came about. Or more likely,
Well, to what would you attribute the zeal, though?
Well, it's like Josiah. I always read it. He was just kind of this young, innocent person, and when he read this, he tore his clothes. He's, oh my gosh, we're not following this, So it's almost like he realized that this previous generation had been just completely ignoring it, which seems implausible that over the course of one generation they could have completely forgotten about the covenant. So more likely they just made it up at that time. But that would also be a good explanation, is that just this group.
Yeah, that last point you made is a really good one, actually. It doesn't seem plausible to me that they would have just skipped a generation like that.
Yeah, I don't think they actually discovered anything. I think they just wrote the Book of Deuteronomy, and I think it was all political. They wanted to centralize it, like we read in the Bible Unearthed. It was a political motivation. They wanted to centralize everything around Jerusalem, and the Book of Deuteronomy basically does that, although it doesn't name Jerusalem.
Yeah, the Book of Deuteronomy is almost like a codification of the rest of the Torah into one little package.
And the jump off point for getting rid of the high places and the idols and the Asherah and all that stuff. But maybe the elevation of Yahweh was, once they wanted to centralize the cult in Jerusalem, maybe they also wanted to, just going off of what Kelly said, maybe in addition to centralizing the cult in general in Jerusalem, they also wanted to do what you said, where they wanted to just elevate Yahweh as the chief God. So maybe before that, like you said, they believed that Yahweh was just the God of Israel. Everyone else had their own gods. One of the sons of El, if they thought of it that way, I don't know. But
I have a suggestion. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
But anyway, during this process of centralization, they also promoted Yahweh as the main man, the chief God, maybe the only God. I don't know. Probably not.
They also wanted to suppress the fact that there was a father and a sons of God, so they wanted to, the synchronicity of bringing it together eliminates the distinction. So it's theological as well as political.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, and that would just further help the centralization of the whole thing. So.
And I just wanted to throw this out as a possible motivation for why they were finally inspired to elevate Yahweh to the equal status with El. As far as from reading Finkelstein and Silberman, we learned that this process didn't actually begin with Josiah's reform, but began with Hezekiah. And you might remember that the reason why Hezekiah's kingship was important was because of the Assyrian Empire came and conquered the northern kingdom, and then there's sudden influx to the south. Suddenly Jerusalem became significant and important for the first time. Before that, it was a lesser kingdom. And so all of a sudden, I think that was the impetus to the whole thing, is the Assyrian conquest of the northern kingdom made Jerusalem suddenly significant, and that's at the time of Hezekiah, and it's at his time, I think, that this Yahweh-only cult began.
Oh, that to me that makes a lot of sense of things, because you might have had this kind of influx of worshippers of these other gods, and they're not going to listen to the priests, of Yahweh. And then the king, of course, was viewed as, I don't know. I mean, especially if you look at the earlier traditions, like around David and Solomon, like the king was like a divine son of God, and so his whole authority is based on his relationship to Yahweh. And if you get all these worshipers coming in from the north,
Or worshiping Baal, maybe.
Right, yeah, or maybe even they just have their own traditions about Yahweh and their own. Right. They never were involved with the whole temple cult, and so it was just maybe a way to kind of get them all on board, and even from almost a very basic idea that the Levites didn't have their own inheritance, so they depended on these sacrifices for their livelihood. I mean, we see that emphasized so much in the Torah. You have to, they can eat the sacrifices. I mean, that's what they live off, the sacrifice.
Yeah. And if they were well integrated into the political structure at large, I mean, all the more reason to centralize it around one cult, right?
Yeah, exactly.
One cult in one city.
Mm-hmm.
And to persuade the newcomers, the immigrants from the north, what better way than to say, hey, oh wow, look, we discovered this old book that we had lost track of, and look what it says in here. Wow.
It establishes without beyond the shadow of a doubt the primacy of the temple Yahweh cult.
Right.
That does make some sense.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Shauna? I think we put it to sleep.
Actually, I hear the voice of the. Are you guys in the same room, Mr. and Mrs. Shauna? I think they walked away, maybe.
Okay. I just want to make sure I'm not missing any. We should go to 5 probably, but I want to make sure I'm not missing anything that I put in my notes on 4. I talked about all that. Yeah, Torah was meant to be, the law was meant to be a replacement for wisdom. We talked about that. Yeah, Proverbs describes wisdom at the side of Yahweh in his great works, whereas Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah, describes Yahweh as working alone. That was one thing I noticed that was interesting. Because, Isaiah is broken down into those 3 parts, the pre-exilic and the 2 post-exilic parts. If I can find where that was. Yeah, where was that?
I guess one reason I have trouble with the association of wisdom with the God is that there's all these references to wisdom, and none of them seem to portray it as being, a direct object of worship or reverence, directly.
Well, yeah, I agree. I want to actually reread through this chapter to see where she makes that explicit connection. But for me, the big thing is, the Garden of Eden linkage between the tree and Asherah and wisdom, and then the evidence of this same myth theme, the same kind of formation of the pantheon and the linkages between everyone within it, not just in Israelite religion, but in earlier Canaanite religion, and then also you're seeing in Babylonian religion and Hittite religion. And like, for example, we talked about earlier in Babylonian religion, Ishtar, if she's an equivalent of Asherah, she's described as the queen of heaven, which we definitely have with Asherah at least. Maybe not wisdom per se, but Ishtar is also described as the goddess of wisdom there. So when you take all of it together, I think it makes a decently strong case. But you're right. I mean, nothing is like explicit.
The other thing I don't see is, like, we do see examples of Yahweh and Asherah being mentioned in parallel, where it talks
Right.
about Yahweh and Asherah, or actually it says Yahweh and his Asherah, but which
Right.
makes it ambiguous whether it's talking about a god or some kind of a object of some sort.
Like
But,
his wisdom.
Yeah, but we don't really see God and wisdom talked about with that kind of parallelism. We talk about some of the actions of God being ascribed to wisdom, but we don't really hear God and wisdom together did this. We don't really see it said that way,
Mm-hmm.
which would be kind of what I would expect if they were originally a separate God. So that means some of those things being absent is what makes me question some of this.
It occurs to me, I've done a little bit of studying of some of the more primitive religions, and there is kind of a deity which personifies wisdom in some of the African diaspora, and that would be someone like Obatala, but he's male, and so I don't think. I just throw that out there as a tangent.
Well, the Gnostics had Sophia, which is the Greek word for wisdom, and
Right.
that was
Sophia was female.
Yeah, but I don't really I'm not really buying there's any connection between Sophia. I don't think it tells us anything about what the early Israelites believed.
Yeah, we do have to remember maybe the context of this chapter is that it's just a piece of all she's trying to show is that there was this kind of splitting of the God into maybe two aspects or represented as two different figures. Not even necessarily. I think she's just trying to show this as part of a trend of God being. Maybe this is an early version of it, like that ended up splitting into two separate figures, but at least I think she does clearly, though, make the case that at least that was a very strong theme in this wisdom-related literature is that wisdom is related as something that comes after, or it's a means by which God creates and is represented as a separate figure.
Yeah.
I think it is still significant to the overall purpose of the book, even if you don't buy the specific argument that Proverbs, for instance, is referring to a separate deity. It still fits the overall idea of this kind of duality of God idea.
Her view is not completely absurd, and in fact, we know for a fact that there were early Christian groups that read Proverbs 8 as talking about wisdom, as referring to the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. We know that theology existed.
Yeah, actually, that was when I just read the Bible on my own a few years ago when I first kind of, just decided to read it, and that's when I really started kind of getting into Christianity, I guess. But when I came across that, I was like, wow, and I was still in the mindset of like, oh, well, everything in the Old Testament, or so much of the Old Testament is really about Jesus,
Yeah.
So when I saw that, I instantly thought, like, wow, that sounds a lot like John's Logos intro to the Gospel.
But I think these are examples of later theologians reading their theology back into the Old Testament.
Oh, I do too.
I do not believe the writer of Proverbs had these connections in mind. I see no evidence of that.
No, I don't either. I'm just saying that I think it was pretty natural as from a Christian reading of the Proverbs through a Christian lens. It's very natural to associate that personified wisdom with the Logos, and therefore Jesus.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, I found what I was looking for. Proverbs says that wisdom was beside Yahweh in his great work, whereas Isaiah is emphatic that Yahweh worked alone. Isaiah was contradicting an existing belief that there had been someone with Yahweh in the work of the creation, since such a figure would have been quite inconsistent with his proclamation of absolute monotheism.
Yes, but we can't take for granted that Isaiah is addressing the verse in Proverbs. There's other passages that could suggest that Yahweh did not work alone. Genesis is a perfect example where it says, "Let us create man in our own image."
Right, that's
That
true.
could have
Yeah.
been taken as evidence that God didn't work alone, and Isaiah could be countering that.
Well, does anyone want to read the summary chapter or summary paragraph of this chapter? Chapter 4. Kelly, you want to read it?
Sorry, am I still on here?
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't remember if I had my... No, I actually have my phone in my pocket. I'm actually doing some things.
Oh, okay.
Also, I don't have any screen in front of me right now, so sorry.
Oh, no problem. Anyone want to read it?
Sure, I'll read it.
Okay, good job.
It's the last paragraph, right?
On 67, yeah.
It says, "Wisdom was not forgotten. The female aspect of Yahweh was known to the first Christians. Paul described Jesus as the power of God and the wisdom of God, a twofold incarnation. In Romans 10:6-10, he takes words which in Deuteronomy 30:12-14 are said of the law, and in Baruch 3:29-30 of wisdom, yet he applies them to Christ. In each case, there was something or someone who was not inaccessible in heaven or far away, but on earth and near at hand. The evangelists implied Jesus spoke as wisdom. The words which Matthew 23:34 attributes to Jesus, Luke 11:49 attributes to wisdom. The Ebionites, an early Jewish Christian group, told of a vision of a pair of great angels who were the Son of God and the Holy Spirit, male and female. Several Gnostic writings describe twofold angels with a male and female aspect. Some early Christian writers, especially in the Eastern Church, perpetuated in their teachings about the Holy Spirit the mothering and creative roles of the Lady Wisdom. Their greatest church in Byzantium was dedicated to her, Hagia Sophia, the Holy Wisdom. It is only by recognizing this double aspect of the ancient Yahweh that we can begin to understand the writings of the first Christian centuries with their trinity of El Elyon, Yahweh, and Wisdom.
You know, that actually, which to me, like if I had to pick one thing that early Christian writing that I wish we would discover in its full form, might be the Gospel of the Hebrews.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think I don't remember where our quote from that come from. Maybe I don't know, one of those early guys in the 2nd century, I think, had some. There's only like 7 short quotes from it. But one of them is when Jesus is baptized, he refers to the Holy Spirit as his mother, and he says, I think, after I was baptized, my mother held me by one hair and took me up to the top of a mountain, which is interesting, you know, because it does say in Mark the Spirit drove Jesus to the desert, and then it says in Luke and Matthew that he was tempted by the devil and he went up on a tall mountain or on the top of the temple, whichever version you read. But it is interesting. Jesus called the Holy Spirit his mother.
Can I mention something else before we get too off the subject of this connects to? We were looking for a summary paragraph about this chapter of the book. But the way that Margaret Barker writes, the 3rd to last paragraph, or maybe the 2nd to last paragraph, tends to be the summary of the chapter. The very last paragraph tends to be looking forward at how it connects to what she's going to say later in the book. So using the final paragraph is not always the best way to get her summaries.
I do feel like that was a pretty good summary, though, of the chapter. I think that pretty much.
If you go back to the previous 2 paragraphs, you'll see a difference.
Yeah, those two do summarize a lot of what she talked about. She's looking forward a lot in the very last chapter. You're right. I'll just read the one on 66. From this brief outline, it can be seen that wisdom, or the spirit of wisdom, was identical in many of its functions with the spirit of Yahweh, and we must assume with Yahweh. For example, Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 9, verse 17. All were aspects of, or ways of talking about, the power which created the world, guided Israel's history, empowered kings to uphold the divine order with their just rule, and gave immortality to those who they possessed. Yahweh/wisdom was manifested in the prophets and above all in the kings. As late as the wisdom of Solomon, this identification of Yahweh and wisdom was remembered. Quote, "For it is God who gave me unerring knowledge of what exists, to know the structure of the world and the activity of the elements." Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7, verse 17. Compare, quote, "I learned both what is secret and what is manifest, for wisdom, the fashioner of all things, taught me." Again, Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7, verse 22. It is now widely recognized that the name Yahweh must have meant, quote, "He causes to be," or "He creates," rather than "I am." And this brings the ancient Yahweh even closer to the creating wisdom of the later texts. The expulsion of wisdom and her corruption was seen by the apocalyptists, as the key to understanding the evils of their age. First Enoch, verses 6 through 10, describes the angels seizing the heavenly knowledge for themselves and bringing it to earth, where it became the cause of corruption and bloodshed. Suter's study of the fallen ones shows how this myth indicates a situation where there is rebellion from within rather than sin or evil imposed from without. He argues that the Enochic writer saw the fallen ones as the priests of the Second Temple. If he is correct, then their attitude to wisdom, taking it for themselves in order to rule the earth, fits well with 2 other positions adopted by the Enochic writer, that wisdom was driven out before the exile, and that the cult of the Second Temple was not pure. And then we already read the very last paragraph. So, chapter 5!
Yeah. I want to just finish one more thing there. When it talks about wisdom being driven out before the exile, I'm still not convinced that wisdom was meant to refer to a god there, even with the sure I am. I think when it's saying wisdom was driven out before the exile, it's really just a way of saying that the exile was folly, that there was a foolish thing we should not have done, and we were wiser before then.
Although it is an interesting coincidence, you have to admit, that Asherah was driven out before the exile.
Well, and also, another way that's tied in is that Jeremiah talks about the women attributing the invasion of the Babylonians, and I don't remember exactly where this is. I don't have it in front of me, but it is in chapter 4 where she cites that part in Jeremiah, and I did check it and read it in the context. But anyway, it's a group of women saying, no, this is not because we've turned away from Yahweh, it's because we've turned away from the Queen of Heaven that the Babylonians are invading.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's interesting that, and that of course coincides, I think, with the idea that wisdom was abandoned or forsaken before the exile.
We read that text, in fact, a little earlier. It's Jeremiah 44.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah, I was a little late getting in. So.
No worries. Any final thoughts on 4?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up this this business of then linking the wisdom with the Holy Spirit is interesting to me because I mentioned this also in a comment that I put on Facebook as far as this would make Jesus not only wisdom, but Jesus would also be the Holy Spirit. And I find this interesting, particularly because one text that's particularly came to my mind was in John 16:7, where Jesus basically says that unless I leave, the Holy Spirit won't come. And it seems to be put in his words that the two are the same person, basically. It's almost like I put in the Facebook thing that's the reason why you never see Superman and Clark Kent in the same room,
Right.
because they're the same person,
Right.
That's a good way of looking at it.
And there are expressions elsewhere in the New Testament of, I mentioned Romans 8:9 and Philippians 1:19, where it speaks of the Spirit of Christ or the Spirit of Jesus Christ, and Acts
Who
16.
was the Lord?
And Acts 16:7 speaks of the Spirit of Jesus. So linking the Holy Spirit to Jesus, usually Christians just suspect that that means that he's in control or sends the Spirit, so that the Spirit issues both from the Father and the Son. But it could be an equating or an apposition, basically, meaning that it's an explanation of the term, the Spirit who is the Christ, who is Jesus. And lastly, I want to, this is actually a little bridge to the next chapter, but it's related to this point. On page 82 of her book, page 82 at the top, where she's quoting the Ascension of Isaiah. Do you see that?
Page what?
Page 82 of her book, she's quoting the Ascension of Isaiah.
Oh yeah, first then Moses, blah blah blah.
Yeah, and so it says the Ascension of Isaiah is an apocalypse expanded by Christians at the end of the first century. It has two Yahwehs. It says, "And I saw how my Lord and the angel of the Holy Spirit worshipped, and both together praised the Lord." The reason why I highlight that, of course, is this expression, the angel of the Holy Spirit. I had never seen that in my life, but I started thinking of that as in Greek, this is where you see the term of, it's a genitive, and one way of using the genitive is genitive of apposition, meaning it's a way of explaining, so that it can be translated the angel who is the Holy Spirit. And the same thing can be said then, I think that shines, if that's true, and I think it's a real possibility in the context of the use of the language. When we were talking before about like Yahweh and the angel of Yahweh, I think the same possibility can extend there, as far as if it's an appositional term, it basically is a way of explaining it, so that the angel who is Yahweh is an acceptable translation.
That's interesting. Yeah, definitely. And is this in the original, or in one of the redactions of the Ascension? The part he's quoting, or the part that she's quoting in here?
That I don't know.
Because I know there's like a pocket gospel that Christians stuck in the original.
It's like the second half of it. It's supposed to be a Christian expansion.
Not related to Barker's book, but something that was said a few minutes ago made this come to my mind, so I just want to throw the question out there. Talking about, John talking about, when Jesus says, I have to go so the Holy Spirit can come after I leave. Could that be evidence that the writer of John knew the book of Acts? Because Acts has Jesus leave before the Holy Spirit comes at Pentecost. Or vice versa, or possibly part of an argument that Acts knew John, but I doubt that. I think it would more likely be part of an argument that John knew Acts. But it would have to be part of a bigger argument, but does that seem plausible to you guys?
Actually, this I was just reading Gospel Fictions today by Randall Helms, and he actually suggests that John interpreted a separate tradition about the Spirit coming after Jesus left.
Okay.
And eventually diverged into what we see in John and what we see in Acts. Like, John and Luke were working with maybe a common idea, and they just expressed it in different ways.
I'll have to read that.
Yeah, it's a great book. I just finished it today. Anyway, he says, because you remember John, when after Jesus is resurrected, he breathes on the disciples. He says, "Receive the Spirit." So he actually gives the Spirit after he's resurrected before he goes away. So
Okay.
it's different. It's totally different than the whole Pentecost idea you see in Acts.
Before,
You know,
I forget if it's an ascension in John.
it's after the ascension in Acts, and yeah, it's before the ascension in John. So
Okay.
maybe a separate tradition there.
That's
Or it could
interesting.
be John thought he could improve on Acts. I don't know, but it seems,
Yeah.
I think what Helm says seems more likely.
I want to get back to Barker, but yes, thank you for that.
No problem.
Although that is a book we might consider reading eventually. Randall Holmes' book. I'd like to read that eventually. Anyway. So, anything else on 4? Want to go to 5?
Do it.
If we have to.
Actually, I need you guys to talk about it because just to make sense of, we may not be on it for very long, but just to make sense of, see what you guys gathered as valuable.
Part of my problem was I read both these chapters this morning, and I spent a huge amount of effort trying to make sense of chapter 4 and taking notes and doing highlighting and stuff. And by the time I got to chapter 5, I was just so fatigued from doing chapter 4 that I didn't really have the energy to apply to chapter 5.
I think
It's
you
okay.
you saved yourself a lot of frustration.
Yeah, basically for me, chapter 5 was a very broad, in-depth look at a lot of how angels are talked about and presented, the angelology of Jewish and Christian writing. What exactly were angels in regards to God? All that sort of stuff. And there seems to be a lot of fluidity, as she puts it, between like sometimes in certain pieces of literature, a particular angel will be associated with a particular act, like an angel of judgment, but then in other writings, or even in the same writing at a different time, there'll be a different angel taking on that role. So it's all over the place, is what I got. Like, angelology is just all over the place. Like, they're an aspect of God. They're totally separate from God. Different angels play the same role at different times, or different roles. It's just a huge, giant mess, is what I got, basically.
Yeah. I had one issue on page 71, in the middle of it, where she cites Zechariah 4:10. And she's saying the roles of Yahweh were divided among all the archangels.
Yeah.
Had formerly been known as the 7 eyes of Yahweh, Zechariah 4:10. Now, when I look up Zechariah 4:10, I see the reference to the 7 eyes, but I see nothing there connecting it to archangels. In fact, the best connection there is actually to the 7 lights in the menorah, which actually Barker actually mentions that later on in this chapter. But I see nothing there regarding archangels, which is just like, why does she cite that passage?
Well, she may be assuming her interpretation of the menorah thing, or the 7 angels in general there.
I think partly also, I didn't look up that text in Zechariah, but I had in mind, you guys may know that I wrote a commentary on the book of Revelation, and
I'd like to read that.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
No, anyway, my take on the seven spirits in Revelation, which may be based on the Zechariah text, I think are the 7 archangels, and these are the 7 angels that pour out God's judgment. You see them they pour out the
bowls.
They blow the trumpets, and then later on they pour out the bowls. These are the 7 angels. I think they're the 7 spirits at the beginning of Revelation. The 7 spirits.
It's certain that the writer of Revelation had Zechariah in mind and made many references to Zechariah.
Right, all over the place, yeah.
But I don't think it's accurate to use Revelation in interpreting Zechariah. I mean, I think that's retroactively putting later theology that may not be in Zechariah.
Well, I think that...
One thing she said later on that threw me off was that we have to retroject from the later text to properly interpret the earlier texts, and I'm like, that's really iffy. Like,
Yeah.
that was toward the end of the chapter. Sorry, Kelly, or whoever's trying to talk.
No, you said the same thing. I think that's an important thing we need to talk about. Is her methodology for the whole book really is saying these later writings preserve their understanding of the Old Testament text, and that since they're closer to the time of writing, maybe they just were aware of the more of the context of the Old Testament. Like, kind of they knew more of what was between the lines than what we can do now. But that's kind of, I think, the premise of a lot of her books. So I think if we don't agree with that methodology, that probably throws the whole book into a pretty serious question, because it depends so heavily on that idea.
Yeah, I think because she is positing that unbroken connection to this early form. I think that's why in other places she's trying to stress, like John put it, finding fossils, quote unquote, of this idea in the actual early literature, the earliest literature we have. But yeah, that is a big part of her methodology that's kind of iffy. Yeah, so I agree. Especially in the case of the angelology.
We were talking about basically what is she doing in this chapter, and as I think of it, what I think is going on, even though she doesn't make this explicit, but to some extent this would go hand in hand with Bart Ehrman's book on how Jesus became God, is she's laying the groundwork for the idea that I think when you use the phrase deosis, basically where a human being can become a god, and she's saying that so it happened with Jacob. He became Israel. She's saying that Jacob, as Israel, was an archangel as well as a human being, and that happened with Enoch becoming Metatron. He becomes one of the archangels, and as an archangel, he then reflects a different aspect of Yahweh. And so basically she's saying, I think then, thus Jesus has done the same thing in that tradition, is he becomes Yahweh, an archangel, but he was a human. So it supports this, in that aspect, this chapter would support the idea that a human could become God in Jewish theology.
The other thing too, yeah, like Metatron is the lesser Yahweh, right? And then Melchizedek too is described as the little Yahweh or something like that.
Question:
right?
Is that Barker's terminology, or is she actually getting that from a quotation?
I'm pretty sure it's from a quotation.
I didn't catch what quotation she got that from.
I thought it was First Enoch.
Yeah, I think it's in Enoch.
Or maybe 30 Enoch. I think the little Yahweh.
Somewhere in the Enoch literature.
Yeah, but I think it is important that we have to remember this whole. Cause I got into this late in the game, so I read 4 and 5 to prepare for this, and then I've started to go back and read from the beginning to catch up. I noticed her basic thesis for the book that she highlights. It's like the only sentence she highlights at the end of her introduction is basically like Jesus is Yahweh, and he's the son of El Elyon. And so I guess you got to remember, like, this whole thing is kind of like more about the views that were around a few hundred years before Jesus' time. Like, I'm trying to look at it in terms of what she's trying to do with the whole book, and what she's saying is that we don't have to look to a Hellenistic context to explain the idea of Jesus being an incarnated God. Because mainstream scholars say that's a foreign idea to Judaism, right? So I think what she's trying to do more is just show that this idea was already well rooted in Judaism. And,
yeah.
I think as far as it goes, she does a pretty good job of showing that.
Your mic is kind of cutting out. We could hear you, but you got faint.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, maybe it doesn't go back so far as like to the very early days, but although she is making that case,
yeah.
But but if she didn't want to take it that far, she could at least say that, pre-Christian era, you're already having conceptions of this Jesus-like figure in literature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, earlier when Wayne was, I don't know if he was referencing page 83 or not, but where it says these 7 spirits or eyes of Yahweh became the 7 archangels, all of them were present in the Messiah because he manifested the Lord in his entirety. Then he says the 7-fold spirits were associated with Davidic kings, and the 7-fold presence can be traced through into the Gnostic texts and into the early Christian writings. I think that kind of encapsulates her view. Oftentimes she's not interpreting the old in light of the new in order to get what they're meaning. She's saying that there's a continuity between the two. Now, if you don't accept that, if you just say, well, they use, say, like the 7-fold imagery in Revelation because they were cool images, and not necessarily that there was this continuity of this viewpoint that extends all the way into the New Testament. If you don't accept that, then you can just say that these are just convenient or prevalent images that were used rather than maintaining that there's a direct connection. And that's encapsulates where the problem is that do you accept that there is this total continuity between the old and new, that these forms, just express themselves at a later time?
I find that actually too implausible, but maybe I just haven't thought about it enough. But
The continuity.
it seems to me that a lot of the stuff in the New Testament seems to be just a natural evolution from questions in the New Testament time period. And I see no way to look for a reason to look for older roots for a lot of stuff there.
So you think the New Testament stuff is just midrash, basically?
No, I think it's working out of theology and stuff. Trying to come up with a new theology that makes sense and stuff, and kind of going back and forth between different approaches. But I think it's a lot of trial and error going on.
And you can just use stuff that looks good from the Old Testament in order to give it, a flavor that this is, without actually there being any direct connection. Just because the text is present and you can use it.
Yeah, the other question, is like she's saying we don't have to look for Greek influences because we have these, First Temple influences that are remembered. Maybe we don't have to look for Greek influences, but there seems to be a lot of other evidence saying that we should take Greek influence into consideration. I mean, she has to deal with the positive reasons for why we should take Greek influences into consideration, and I don't think she does that.
Oh yeah, I wonder if she's even. Okay, I think she's saying like we don't necessarily have to just rely wholly on the Hellenistic concepts to explain the Jesus movement or the idea of a Jesus figure, because there was a Jewish conception of this type of figure beforehand, which incidentally I'm reading through Richard Carrier's book, and obviously he's well aware and argues for the fact that there's a lot of Hellenistic influence, but also stresses that there was a lot of Jewish already in Jewish literature, and this kind of expectation happening. So I think maybe Barker's homing in on those particular Jewish aspects and saying we can explain a lot of Jesus just based off of what's happening in Judaism, pre the turn of the millennium or whatever you want to say. So I don't know if her thesis or her statements are necessarily discounting in their entirety the Hellenistic influence, but she's just saying we don't have to rely on them by themselves to explain Jesus. That's how I'm reading her.
Okay.
Is that fair?
I think so.
By analogy, the last turn of the millennium that we experienced in our own lifetimes, did any of that millennium fever really have its roots in the previous millennium? No, I don't think so. It was just the fact that the millennium was changing that people, started thinking about a change of times, or there's going to be some significant differences in the 21st century. But that doesn't necessarily imply that there was any kind of direct connection with the Millennium Fever that went on in the change from the 19th to the 20th century,
Yep.
or first first millennium to the second millennium.
I like that analogy. Thank you for that.
Except I don't know what that analogy is. If we're talking about this change in millennium from the first century, if that's what you're saying, if you're trying to make the analogy to our millennial change, to the millennial change of the early Christians faced, is that what you're saying?
No, I was saying that, just because it's just the changes of millenniums that cause similar reactions to people existing at the time, that there's not necessarily any connection with what the people were thinking, say, of the previous millennium that influenced how people dealt with the change over to the second millennium.
Yeah, I thought you were comparing 1000 AD to 2000 AD. And not BC to AD.
Okay, that's what I thought you were doing, and I was just going to say that sort of transition, I don't think anyone at that time would have realized, because it's based on a calendar that was later imposed on history. That's not right. That wasn't their own calendar, so they weren't conscious of any sort of transition from one millennium to another.
Yeah, when I said millennium, I was just meaning that's my shorthand of saying roughly when Jesus was born, the beginning of the millennium, based on our later calendar, as you say. I wasn't trying to say that there was some end of millennium craze or fervor or anything that was actually in itself playing a role in any of that. I'm just saying that, already in Jewish literature, before Jesus was born, even if he was born in 160 BC, already before Jesus was born, whenever that happened to have been, it just so happens it was a change in the turn of the millennium. But anyway, there was already an expectation of a lot of the things that Jesus ended up fulfilling. That's what I'm saying.
So in other words, it was already part of their cultural expectations. There's no reason to appeal to an outside foreign expectations and culture and whatever. It goes against Occam's razor to appeal to a Hellenistic influence when they already had a Jewish influence there.
That's not what I'm saying exactly. I'm saying that...
That's what I'm saying.
Both of the things are contributing. You definitely have Hellenistic influence, but you, I think, also definitely have the root of it, the core of it, I think, was rooted in pre-Christian Jewish literature. And then you've got an accretion of the dying and rising conception God thing, and then other Hellenistic things kind of merging into this messianic expectation type of thing.
Though, of course, apologists will point to this, if there's an earlier Jewish expectations that they could point to, then they're going to discount any sort of prophecy. Well, or particularly if there was Jewish expectations for a Messiah that would fulfill, or I think to some extent, it may sound weird, but to some extent, this Margaret Barker's book is an apologetic for Christianity. To say that, yeah, this is exactly what there was a branch of Judaism, the earlier one, in fact, the better one, the more faithful one, that Christianity represents, and everything fits those expectations. And so when the Jews say, oh, you Christians are misinterpreting all these prophecies, and she'll say, no, look, this is exactly what these, to some extent, it's really fulfilling what original Jewish expectations. So to some extent, this book is it's a book of apologetics.
Yeah, there's no need to look at the most immediate source or effects are the ones that are most significant and should be considered. The other ones are too distant or not direct enough in order to be significant for most of the apologetical arguments.
Exactly, and a lot of, like someone said earlier, a lot of this ties into mythicism in a way, because again, a lot of what Carrier is arguing is that there were these expectations. He actually takes the 70 weeks thing and 77s, whatever it is, and he says that wasn't just an after the fact prediction. Because he's going off the mythicist view, he's saying Jesus was was born, or was said to have been born at that particular time, because that's what the most straightforward reading of Daniel said. So he wasn't actually born, he was just placed in that point in history. And that would be the view on that side of the fence, that, like in Isaiah 53 too, like, it isn't a prediction, it's just that Jesus was invented because this kind of figure was expected already. Or you could say, even from a historicist view, a minimal historicist, you could say there was a Jesus figure, but all this other expectation ended up getting tacked onto him, and whatever, yeah.
After the fact, you mean?
Yeah, after the fact, right.
There's a passage in this chapter I remember reading, but I can't find it now. And it was just a quote, I think, from some Jewish source suggesting the idea that God only created, one angel, and then that angel in turn created everything else. Do you remember what page that was on here?
I remember reading it, and actually that jumped out at me too, because that's exactly what the Jehovah's Witnesses believe.
Mm-hmm.
What jumps out at me about it is that could have been an influence on Marcionism.
How so?
Because they believe the demiurge basically created the world.
Oh, yeah.
So if the demiurge is like the only creation of the real God, at some point, and then...
Well, I think that's what she means when she talks about it influenced later Christian and also Gnostic writing. She specifically mentions that. So she probably deals with that too. But yeah, I could see where you're going with that.
Of course, it goes beyond that in the sense that it's saying that the demiurge is the only creation that the creator, or let's say the high God, created the demiurge only. He didn't create anything else. He didn't create any of the other gods.
Page 72, I think.
One of my notes I put in this chapter was, I thought was interesting, in Daniel, she says the unnamed angel in Daniel is not Michael, which is another angel mentioned in Daniel, but actually meant to be the great angel equals Yahweh. This is going off of her theory. Coming to judge the earth and defend or restore Jerusalem. And Isaiah 26, she says Isaiah 26 and the Assumption of Moses, chapter 10, agree about that there's this angel who's equal to Yahweh coming to judge the earth. That was one thing I wrote down in there. I'm just reading through some of my notes. I didn't have that much to say on this chapter.
Not much to say on this chapter, but this chapter seems to have the closest connection to the title of this book. So maybe Barker considers this to be a key chapter.
It was just so all over the place. Like, angels were conceived in too many weird ways, according to what she was quoting me. So, one thing...
Is the term great angel her term, or is that from a quote?
I don't know. It may be her term. One other thing I found interesting that I wrote down was in the Testament of Daniel describes the great angel as a mediator for Elion, which is exactly how 1 Timothy describes Jesus.
What page are you on?
I don't know. Again, I didn't write down pages, which I will in the future for my notes.
If you're talking about the testimonies of the 12 patriarchs, I think it's testimony of Dan, not Dan.
Yeah, testimony of Dan. I'm sorry. Yeah, I thought she was abbreviating there. Also, this is another thing that I think is important to her overall thesis is a lot of the terms applied to the angel figure in Old Testament literature is applied to Jesus, like the Prince of Peace. So Isaiah describes the angel as the Prince of Peace in Isaiah 9:6. Actually, let me look that up because I didn't. All these titles that Jesus has were actually titles applied to Yahweh or the angel, depending on how you agree or disagree with Barker. Yeah, for a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. Okay, so she's interpreting that enthronement. Isn't that most commonly understood as like an enthronement oracle or whatever it's called? Like, right, with the Emmanuel thing? What does Dr. Price call those? Enthronement oracles, right?
I can't remember. I know when she cites Isaiah 7:14 as referring to some like mother goddess giving birth to the child. I cannot follow her on that because the text of Isaiah it's pretty clear to me that the child mentioned in 7:14 is the same as the child mentioned in chapter 8, including the fact that chapter 8, verse 8 mentions Emmanuel a second time.
Yeah, that I actually disagree with her on too. I remember that. And I think that's actually talking about, it's not prophetic at all. And I think she's taking it to be that way.
But the mother's meant to be a human being there, you know.
Right.
At the time it's being written, or at the time it's supposed to be set, or, you know, however you want to take that. But
yeah.
And there was another passage I had the same problem with. It wasn't the Isaiah 9:6 though. It was something else elsewhere that I also thought it was referring to a human being and not a goddess as the mother.
One thing she argues, kind of in summary, I'm just going through my notes, for this whole chapter, because she covers a lot of how angels are represented in a lot of different literature spanning along many centuries. And enthronement psalms, yeah, thank you. Basically, like things you're saying to a new king or whatever. Anyway, she says, in all cited literature from at least 2nd century BCE to 5th century AD, this is in regards to the angelology, there is a, quote, second figure that's some figure as an alternative to Yahweh or God. An angel, she's arguing, who is granted divine status and undergoes enthronement. So that's one of the things she kind of says in summary of this huge survey of the portrayal of angels in this literature.
I think a lot of this goes to the philosophical issue, though, about how they pictured God. I mean, early in Genesis, you have a very anthropomorphic God where, you know, he's described in very human terms. He walks in the garden. He has to go down or send messengers down to Sodom and Gomorrah to see if what is heard about those cities is actually true. But later on, God is seen, you know, by the time Isaiah's time, as being more transient and, you know, and more of a more abstract and spiritual and stuff.
Right.
But once he's made too transient, they need a mechanism for him to interact with the world. So that's when you start getting intermediaries in order to deal with the fact that, you know, we have to protect his transience but still have him be able to connect with us.
Right. And that's what she's saying was the later role that angels took on, because they really were just one of the many sons of God, just like Yahweh was. And she's saying they later took on that role when Yahweh gets promoted, of the mediator. The other thing I forgot, second figure angel who is granted divine status and undergoes enthronement and takes on the role of judge as high priest or a warrior figure, which was interesting because, like in Hebrews, a big part of Hebrews is Jesus as a high priest. So I think there's some kind of connection here between some of these angel figures and their roles and what Jesus is doing. Like, he's described as a judge, as a high priest. So there's some kind of connection going on here, but I'm not so sure about the angel thing. I think there's so much diversity, and I think she's boiling it down in a way that's not necessarily justifiable to one core. I think there's just too much diversity to know what's really going on. What do you guys think?
I didn't get much out of this chapter, but I'm assuming it's because I was fatigued from reading it, from studying the previous chapter so much that I really didn't have the mental capacity to really get the chapter at that time.
I had trouble with it too, and it was just all over the place. That was my take. Anyone else want to chime in?
But in both chapters, I haven't seen anything that really pushes me towards her ultimate thesis. I'm just really not seeing it. I think a lot of the connections she makes, so there's just so many dots. You know, there's always random ways of connecting them. But I don't think the connections are actually as meaningful as she makes them out to be.
Mm-hmm.
I honestly don't. I still question, why she even needed this chapter. I don't really think it was a strong help for her case. I thought it just added confusion. But like I said, there were the things that I thought were interesting related to the Jehovah's Witnesses is their view that the witnesses when they read texts that speak about Jesus as the firstborn or the only begotten Son and the firstborn of all creation, their understanding of that is that Jesus was the only one that God the Father created directly, and all other things are created by Jesus. So he was wisdom from Proverbs 8, and Romans, in fact, their translation says all other things came to being through him and for him, and nothing came up into existence apart from him. So that's their understanding, is that very similar to what she's describing here. And also, something interesting too is she made a connection between Michael. Well, I forget exactly how she put it, but as an archangel as well, and she made a connection between Michael and Yahweh. The witnesses wouldn't exactly do that, but they do think. But it would make Jesus. If Jesus is Yahweh, then he would also be Michael, who is the archangel of. That is, let's say the angel that was assigned to the people of Israel, like Yahweh was. And so that's what they think. Jesus was the angel of the Lord, so he is also Michael, the archangel. Anyway, I just thought that was interesting. Similar to, Dr. Price thinks that, because he's on board with Margaret Barker's views, and so he thinks, oh, wow, look at all these insights that the Mormons had from an interesting reading. Anyway, I personally think, you might think I'm biased because I was a former witness, but I do think that there was some interesting insights they had in a sense.
As a former witness, you probably know their beliefs better than I do, but I might be confusing them with a different group. But I thought the belief was that Jesus and Michael were like brothers or something, and, as angels, not identical.
No, they are identical. I was an
Mormonism, they're brothers.
In Mormonism, they're okay. And also the idea of Jesus being, the first of creation and stuff in the Jehovah's Witness ideas. That's the revival of an early Christian view called Arianism after the supposed heretic Arius, and he got in lots of arguments with church father named Athanasius, but
right, they are modern day Arians.
Yeah.
Well, you know what Dr. Price always says about, like Mormonism and Jehovah's Witnesses, is that the founders of these various sects were reading different literature and reading the Bible in a certain way, and they're picking up on these things that Margaret Barker are pointing out.
Mm-hmm.
And, that they're there, but, it depends on, Margaret Barker's taking it one way, and, and then the Jehovah's Witnesses are taking another way, and the Mormons are taking a third way. So they're all looking at the same literature, but they're bringing in different viewpoints and getting different things out of it eventually.
There's also something else in early Christian theology. I can't remember if it was a response to Arianism or if it had a different purpose. But in one of the creeds, it describes Jesus as begotten, not made. Like God didn't create Jesus, God begat Jesus. And early Christians or early Catholics considered that distinction to be important for some reason.
Right. That's because, well, that's the Nicene Creed, and obviously they want to acknowledge what the Bible says, that Jesus was begotten,
Right, born of Mary.
and yet they want to say that that doesn't mean that he was created. Of course, the Arians think that's exactly what it does say. That's what it means. If he was begotten, that means, like every other child that was begotten of a father, they didn't exist. They came into existence.
Yeah.
Let me ask you guys this, like, okay, we're getting like a feel for what she's going for, and we read Gunkel and his take on some of these passages in regards to like the form critical view, at least of him, and whatever else you're aware of in regards to some of the stuff we've talked about, like particular passages and views of the angels and Garden of Eden stuff, all the stuff we talked about. Like, there's, no matter how, it seems to me like no matter how you read it, you're gonna have these odd things in the text that don't make sense, whatever framework you're using. Like, do you guys think that she's, so obviously some of you find more problems than others. Do you guys have a framework where you feel like there's less of these like standout issues in the total picture, or do you think there's just too many of them for Barker, that these standout issues are she's not making a good case, there's too much ad hoc argumentation from her?
I think it's too hot. Yeah. Like I said, I agree with your view that Judaism was originally polytheistic. I agree with your view that there's originally a female goddess, the Ashura, which may have had other names also. But I do not really follow her view that Christianity really has good memories of those things. I think Christianity is reinventing a lot of things from scratch using the Old Testament scriptures.
Yeah, I pretty much go along with that. Other than I will say I think she made a decent case for wisdom, which I'm willing to entertain. I'm not like totally convinced, but I think she makes a decent case that Asherah was wisdom, or that wisdom and Asherah were aspects of Yahweh. But with the angel stuff, I'm just lost, basically.
I don't know. I find the angel stuff pretty interesting because even going back to Genesis, and it's interesting to me, she doesn't talk about Genesis a whole lot, but there's so much where the angel of the Lord or the angel of Yahweh and Yahweh seem to be
that was in an
at the
earlier
same
chapter. I forget it was chapter 2 or chapter 3. She did talk about that earlier.
Oh, she did. Okay, and again, I haven't caught up. I just expected that to be in the angel chapter, but yeah, I haven't read chapter 3. So, but yeah, I think that makes it plausible though that this whole angel idea, like the Melchizedek being an archangel, and he's like a heavenly high priest and a little Yahweh and all that. I think that's pretty plausible that could be an old tradition, because in Genesis you even see a lot of kind of blurred lines between the angel of Yahweh and Yahweh. It's almost like...
I think part of the problem in Genesis is that the stories are not, the narrative order is not the chronological order that they were written in, but the stories have been rearranged as it came together. And I think the Melchizedek thing is just should be placed in a different time period than where it is in Genesis, and it is just talking about some other priests somewhere it's talking about, and the fact that Genesis says so little about Melchizedek made it intriguing to later theologians and later prophets and stuff. So it got to be mentioned more and more. They could just speculate about it.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. I was referring more to the parts where the angel is explicitly mentioned, like like when Abraham is stopped from sacrificing Isaac.
Yeah.
And it's like, wait, who's talking? Is it the angel or is it Yahweh? It's very ambiguous. So I think it's plausible.
The Hebrew word for angel, definitely comes from the Hebrew word for message and stuff. It means messenger.
Yeah.
But from the context and how that word is used, I really, really am tempted to want to read it as like manifestation, or appearance in some sense. Like this was the manifestation of Yahweh to Israel, kind of thing.
And given that I do think she makes a good case for some blurring of the lines between the separation between the angel of Yahweh and Yahweh himself. I think she makes a decent case for that. Which angel? I don't know. Or if there even necessarily needs to be a particular one, or if they're all just different aspects of Yahweh. I'm not super convinced on that either.
Yeah, I didn't buy that. I think the angel of Yahweh is just Yahweh in a visible form.
Yeah, like a theophany, basically.
Yeah.
But I will say that I know where she's going. That Jesus is this great angel, and that I think isn't actually that much of a stretch.
Wayne, I don't think
That's an ancient Christian view. The idea that Jesus is the angel of Yahweh is an ancient Christian view.
Right, exactly, yeah.
I don't think it's correct.
The thing is this an ancient Jewish view?
What you guys just said about the angel of Yahweh being a theophany of Yahweh, I don't think Margaret Barker would disagree with that. I think she would find that plausible.
Yeah, I think that's what she's arguing, pretty much. That these angels are basically manifestations of different aspects of Yahweh. I mean, she's pretty much arguing that.
I wasn't sold on the idea that it was at any point in time considered a separate being from Yahweh. That's why I never was sold on.
So she's saying it's the same being, and you're saying, yeah, that's what you always agreed with. So you're...
Oh, okay. When Doug...
Yeah, she's saying it is Yahweh.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. She's saying all these angels are basically Yahweh.
I misunderstood what you said.
They're the other sons of El who were refigured or reappropriated as different aspects of Yahweh after Yahweh became the chief god.
Okay.
By the way,
Is that right?
I was just going to say I'm very much siding with her in many ways, similar to you, Doug, in the sense that what she says about wisdom and the link to Asherah or the Queen of Heaven and to the Holy Spirit, and I see these connections also with the Qumran literature. So when she goes to, like, there's a Melchizedek text which is unique to the Qumran literature, and First Enoch, which is even though it may be found outside of it, it's still part of that literature, so it's part of that community. So I think here we have this oddball Jewish sect. They were so different from the rest of the Jews. The other Jews didn't have the same perspective, and so I think I can't help but see a similarity between the Christian community and the Essene sect of the Qumran Dead Sea Scroll community. I see a similar tradition there.
Yeah, undeniably, I think. Yeah.
And I feel it harks back to some of these early traditions that we're seeing. So it doesn't seem like such a leap to me.
Yeah, it doesn't seem crazy to me. I just have some problems here and there with some of the connections she's making, but overall, I think she's got a good case.
Well, my biggest impression with the angel, what was most significant to me, because I've always just really had a particular interest in Daniel, but it is really that Daniel is kind of the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
It's the only canonical glimpse we get of this huge angel, archangel / kind of co-region or sub, kind of like sub-deity idea. Like, we only see a little bit of that in Daniel, but it's really is a larger current that probably goes before Daniel and probably was almost directly transferred up to the time of the early Christians. I think it was just
Daniel being written mid-2nd century BC, it's really not that long until you get Christian literature popping up.
Mm-hmm.
150 years,
Right.
140, something.
And the biggest thing that, like, how Daniel just, to me, pervades the whole New Testament. I mean, it's almost like, this idea of, you have this apocalyptic prophecy that it's like it's accurate up to a certain point. You know, like you see that in Daniel. It predicts, well, ostensibly predicts, all of Alexander's exploits, and then how it was divided into 4 kingdoms after Alexander's death. But then up to a certain point, it's like after that, it's completely wrong, and then the world ends, which didn't happen. And it's like almost like what you see in, I guess, the Little Apocalypse or whatever. It's almost like an updated version of that. It's just using the temple. It's like, well, maybe this is what Daniel, it's like maybe we'll try this again with this catastrophe, You
mean the fall of the temple in 70?
Yeah, the fall of the temple in 70. It's like, it's almost the exact same thing as Daniel's prediction of the world ending after Antiochus defiles the temple, It's like it's right up until that point, and then it's like, oh, and then the world ends. It's almost like the same thing with Mark in the Synoptic tradition. It's just like, oh, well, the temple's destroyed, and then the world ends. It's just like Daniel 2.0 or something. It's like a second attempt.
And Daniel itself, at least it seems to be like a reformulation of Jeremiah. So it's like passing the baton.
The apocalyptic literature has a certain characteristic. It always has that certain kind of cyclical kind of outlook. Certain events lead to blah blah blah. So anytime you have them, they're all going to be the same. One thing I wanted to say was that I don't know if Barker argues this or not. I read it somewhere, but somebody argued that as a deity becomes less anthropomorphic and more remote, that a lot of the former characteristics are spun off to other things, just like in the Catholic Church. A lot of direct intercession for different people and different types of things are gone through the Virgin Mary. You pray for Mary to do stuff,
or the saints,
rather than Jesus or God. And that's a tendency that because as the deity becomes more ineffable and more remote and more abstract, that there's still a need for that feeling of more accessibility, that a lot of these characteristics that were formerly Yahweh were spun off to these archangels, their functions and things like that.
Yeah, that's interesting, and you see that in Buddhism too, which what really interests me is another big interest of mine is language and the history of languages. And you have the Indo-European people, and of course we just figured out that these people existed because the language is scattered all over the place, and but along with that, we have a Proto-Indo-European language, but we also have a hypothetical Proto-Indo-European religion, because we see so many, going over to India all the way over to across Europe. We see so many similar trends in religion. So I almost wonder if that's one of those things that kind of maybe was part of it was like a feature of the original Indo-European religion that was inherited by all of these people. Of course, the Jews weren't Indo-European, but I mean, it could be a similar thing, just this early theme that's kind of spread around, because in like Theravada Buddhism, which is kind of the earliest writings we have anyway, you just have the Buddha, period. And he's just kind of this distant, he's very human, you see a lot of his earthly discourses, but then later you see him become more of like, he gives revelations and like he's always existed and all this sort of thing. And but then at that same time you start to see these bodhisattvas who are like you have I can't even remember, Avalokiteshvara, who is like this bodhisattva, so he/she, it's like a sort of ambiguous gender, but they they are always listening to everybody, you know, and they're kind of like the compassion, this present, like presence, all-pervading presence of compassion, and hears the cries of. And it's like this. The bodhisattvas are kind of analogous to the saints in Catholicism. You know, they represent different aspects of, I guess, Buddhahood. You know, and you can kind of talk to them or whatever.
Yeah, I need to study more about Eastern religions. I got a book on them, but I got so many books, I got to prioritize which I'm going to read first.
Yeah, there are different Buddhisms too. Some of them consider, you know, these beings as angelic, or as Kelly said, saints, and some just consider them as gods that are not incompatible with Buddhism. You know, it depends.
Kelly, you said you were really interested in the history of language and stuff. I read an article recently, I forget what site it was on, but it made a very interesting claim that no language before like 1,000 years ago actually had a word for blue. And they're almost wondering if humans didn't see the color blue until that recently.
Oh wow, that's fascinating.
Which is mind-blowing. Yeah.
That is. Well, I'll have to, you know, and I hate to go off. Well, I'm sorry, I can't tell who's talking here. I'm on my phone.
I'm Wayne.
That's Wayne.
Wayne. Okay. Hi, Wayne. I don't want to go take this off topic, but I'll send you something interesting that I read about it today that kind of blew my mind about old words and colors, actually. So.
Nice. Yeah, I know a lot of cultures don't use a separate word for blue and green. They use the same word. And that may have been part of what they're talking about. I think like a lot of Asian languages don't have separate words for blue and green. They'll say green as the grass, or let's just use the word grew as a combination of blue and green. They'll say grew as the grass or grew as the sky, kind of thing, using the same word, but they describe it that way to make the distinction.
Well, if you think about it, it makes sense because the spectrum is a continuum, so there aren't any clear like objective divisions between the different colors.
Yeah. And sorry, I was kind of stalling a little bit until you got back, Doug.
Oh, no problem. I forgot where we left off. I had to step away, and I forgot what topic we were even on. We were talking about angels.
I think we were talking about chapter 5. Yeah, I don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking about the whole like Daniel, son of man, angel kind of apocalyptic aspect of it.
So Reuven says Hebrew had a word for light blue. Okay. So maybe the source I was reading was nonsense. I wasn't really sure.
Could be. Yeah. I've run into that a lot. Well, I'm sure everybody has.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think the least you could say with reasonable certainty is that Jesus, at least, whether he existed or not, took on a lot of the roles of these angel figures described in apocryphal literature, Jewish literature, right? Is that fair?
Yeah.
That's the least. That's the minimal thing, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think at minimum we know that the Christians had access to a lot of this literature and just did creative things with it.
Yeah.
So whether they actually have memories of the earlier meaning of these texts, that I don't really buy. But that the Christians had access to these texts and read them in very creative ways, that I do buy.
Yeah, me too. That's kind of my starting point in reading this, and I haven't moved very far away from it yet. Maybe by the end of the book I will. I see where she's going, and maybe if she keeps giving more evidence in that direction, I will do that.
That's what she's going to do.
Of course, yeah. So, but depending on how I don't know how I'm going to end up at the end of it, but right now I haven't moved very much from my starting position. That it's just kind of like these are just different trends that developed in the intertestamental period, just like you said, creative readings, They may not really go back beyond that period to the original writings.
Yeah, to me the biggest thing, I mean, we've got her interpretations of a lot of these oddball texts, if you want to call them that, or passages. But again, I've already said it twice, like I think the big thing too we have to take into consideration is the parallels between Israelite mythology and their neighbors' mythology. And I think once we take that into account, her case isn't necessarily proven. Actually, it's not by a long shot, but becomes not, at least not crazy. You know what I mean?
I guess my biggest problem is that when she quotes a lot of these scriptures, she says there's like 2 or 3 elements that are in them that she sees. And when I look at the same scripture, I can see, maybe if she says there's 3, maybe I can see 2 of the elements. If she says there's 2, I can maybe see 1 of them. But I rarely see all the elements that she claims is there. In pretty much every case, there's always something missing when I look.
Yeah, and she may be over-interpreting this stuff. I mean, that's a definite possibility. So we'll just have to wait and see what her further evidence is.
Exactly, because I feel like maybe like once you know the whole case and then you go back and read it from the beginning, maybe on that second reading you will see, oh, she's actually justified in this.
Yeah, I was thinking when I was reading the first 3 chapters that this seems to be the kind of book that I'll need to read twice to actually get.
Yeah, because maybe the second time you'll see that she's actually justified in her interpretations, where maybe in the middle of reading it for the first time you don't quite see that yet. But
the last paragraph on page, or the only paragraph on page 94, does, I don't know if it summarizes this chapter very well. It's the last paragraph, and maybe the second to last might be a better summary. No, maybe not.
What did I put? I think I put something actually for.
But we talked about this earlier in the Hangout about her method, and
yeah.
I'm sure you're going to want to quote this paragraph here. But
we'll read it if you want.
Yeah, I guess I'll read the whole paragraph. The angels are and will doubtless remain elusive. Angel texts must not be read in isolation, nor must they be set in a false context. The later Kabbalists may have drawn on ideas found in the Gnostic texts, and these in turn have affinities with Philo. Ultimately, however, we are driven back to the tradition which must have been the root of them all, and this has been largely obscured due to the way in which the Old Testament has been transmitted and then read. A line must therefore be drawn from the later understanding back through the angel texts and into the Old Testament, whence ultimately they sprang. The original understanding of the Old Testament and the angel texts will have been what determined their use in later periods. I don't agree with her on that, but in other words, the latest position will have been determined by the earlier ones. But I do agree with this next sentence she has here. I think this is kind of a fascinating thing to think about. There is a certain perversity in assuming that because we read the Old Testament in a way which differs from that of the ancients, it is they who must be using a fanciful exegesis for their own ends. In order to recover the original understanding of the angel in the Old Testament, it is necessary to retroject from the later positions. This manifold nature of the second deity is abundantly clear in the Christian, Gnostic, and later Jewish texts, as is the name of that second deity. Only the first stage is obscured. What is consistent throughout is the pattern of royal temple imagery associated with the second deity and his characteristic roles. Over 2 millennia, he was the angel, the warrior, the high priest, the scribe, the enthroned one, and the one manifested in human form.
I already read part of that.
Yeah.
That text that paragraph actually is part of the reason why I consider this book somewhat of an apologetic.
Yeah.
Because she's going to say, any claims that the New Testament twists Scripture, we should actually say it represented the earlier understanding of the text. Anyway, I'm hesitant to go along with her there, but.
Yeah, I think her methodology is backwards, and I don't think it's justified. I think the later people are just so creative in their interpretations that we just can't trust to work backwards from them.
Yeah, and I think that there's just this tradition of reinterpretation of different texts that we're reading about or reading of in the like Enochic literature and all these testaments and apocalypses and stuff. And a lot of it is midrash, I think, and it doesn't necessarily go back as far as she wants it to. And but I do like what she says about, and I don't know if she says it in 5 or 4, and I don't know where it's at, but she says we have to be careful that we don't just take for granted the Deuteronomistic viewpoint, which has been imposed on the canon as we have it.
Yeah.
We have to be careful not to just take that for granted, which I agree with her on that, but yeah, the thing about
I think she's arguing
whatever early Christianity says about, the interpretation of this older literature is in continuity with what actually was believed way back then. I think in some cases she has a good case that's probably right. But in a lot of ways, I think it's not necessarily a strong case.
Yeah, I think what you said about her saying not to trust all the stuff that's been painted over by the Deuteronomistic reforms and stuff. But I think she is actually talking to believers and stuff. That Christians, you think the entire Bible is true, so they use the truth from one part of the Bible to interpret something another passage. I don't really think that statement of hers is really very well targeted at critical scholars, because critical scholars are pretty much already doing what she's recommending.
Yeah, I think a lot of them are. You're right. I still think that there's a trend in scholarship, though, to just they're not doing it consciously, but I think they're just taking the Deuteronomistic version, which is what we have, as if it's an accurate picture of the history of Judaism. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They do, because like Barker quotes in her introduction, I think, you see a lot of people saying, "Oh, well, the Jews are so monotheistic. Christianity could have never come out of Judaism."
Right. Exactly.
And she's just showing that's not really true. So I think she is kind of trying to pave a new way with from the mainstream scholarship at that time, and I think I get the feeling from just little bits of what I've read and heard that she actually has influenced the direction of scholarship a little bit, a fair amount. I think she's really, her ideas have kind of had a wide effect.
Somebody said earlier that they felt this chapter was kind of an apologetic. I was saying at the very beginning of this Hangout, actually even before we went live, we were talking about it, that I'm a little bit wary of her because I actually think she believes what she's saying. Not that she believes her thesis as a scholar, but as a religious person, she actually believes in the truth of what she's uncovering.
Yeah,
I think that makes her way too tempted to get into apologetics.
I think it may be playing a role, but on the other hand, when I see the stuff she's talking about with the linkages and the parallels between like Canaanite and Babylonian and Hittite religion, it's like, what kind of Christianity or whatever you want to call it does she have if she's willing to acknowledge like that Israelite religion basically came out of Canaanite religion? You know what I mean?
I think she has some pretty idiosyncratic views, yeah. I think she's a Methodist probably for other reasons, not really because of Methodist theology. I think maybe she doesn't have another church that really would, be more similar to what she believes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just speculating there. We probably shouldn't be speculating about her personally like that, though. It might be inappropriate, but
Maybe it's just because it's very liberal church.
yeah.
But if that's the case, then so she's only with the Methodists because they're the only ones that would take her. Then that would indicate that that their theology doesn't influence her at all. She decided to. She finds whatever she believes whatever she's come to her own conclusions, and she's not been guided by the church at all. And then she happens to look for the church that agrees with what she's come to on her own.
Right. And if she's taking that approach, then if she's really that self-informed about her theology, then I think we could trust her opinions. Or I'm sorry, trust the fact that she's being basically unbiased in her conclusions on some of these topics.
Well, she's being honest anyway. But I think, being a minister is, I'm sure, very important to her. So, she's in a church where she can be a minister. That doesn't preclude, or that doesn't necessarily lead to the fact that she would be biased in her scholarship.
Mm-hmm. But honestly, some of the stuff she's written in here already wouldn't fly in like 99% of Christian churches, probably, right?
Oh yeah, most would consider her a heretic.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think all of them would have a problem, but there are definitely some fundamentalist churches that would have a problem with it.
Yeah. I think just acknowledging the Canaanite connection is a no-no. Even in liberal cafeteria Catholicism, that's a no-no.
Well, somebody mentioned in the Facebook group, I think, and part of that discussion that I think that Dale started, or maybe it was a different thread, but they mentioned the Dr. Heiser guy. He's one of the editors-in-chief of Bible Study Magazine and Logos Bible Software, and he's a believer, and he's vehemently against the idea that there's any polytheism, even in the Divine Council of El.
Wow.
Yeah, he doesn't. He just denies there's a connection with the Canaanite polytheism. That for him, it was always El equals Yahweh. Divine Council were always angels and not demoted sons of God or anything like that. So you could see where his particular believing Christianity influences his scholarship, and why he's not considered. Well, he's considered an apologetic scholar in that area, but is respected for his debunking of ancient astronaut theory and bad archaeology and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, before I left Christianity, I was a fan of what I had read on his writings about the Divine Council because it was taking it away from Trinitarian, like especially texts like "Let us create man in our image." It was taking it away from a Trinitarian concept, which I felt they were reading into the text, and it was acknowledging the original culture, a council of other gods.
Yeah, it was a step away from, rigid evangelical fundamentalism.
Yeah, I'll mention one thing. I was watching some videos of her last week on YouTube after last week's Hangout, and in one of them she was talking a little bit about the Book of Revelation. And one observation that she makes, but I can't agree with her on this at all, but I just find it really interesting that she makes the observation, is that when John says that this is the revelation of Jesus Christ, she interprets that as meaning this is a vision that the historical Jesus had, and then he told that to John later. But it was actually a vision, that Christ received, that was passed on to John to write down.
Yeah.
But I don't buy that. I think he's on the Isle of Patmos, which is what he claims he was, and it's a vision that the spiritual Christ gives to him.
Right, because why would Jesus have a vision of himself depicted as a lamb?
Yeah.
That doesn't seem.
But that's part of the reason I'm just really skeptical of her. Watching those videos and some of those other things she says, it's just like, really? Okay.
Do you actually think that whoever wrote Revelation, that's an actual experience that they had?
No, I think it's entirely literary.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it's totally just made up of like Daniel, Ezekiel.
Yeah.
You know, it's just all that stuff kind of strung together with some new, ideas mixed in. But yeah, I don't think.
It's an obvious literary construction. And
A lot of people try to make the claim that the author of Revelation must have been on drugs or mushrooms or something, but I think there's actually so much intelligence in that, and so much intertextuality with other documents and stuff that you have to be of sound mind to come up with it.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
One of the last, what was that other program that Dr. Price does besides the Bible Geek for like beginner?
Human Bible.
Human Bible. That's pretty much defunct now, though.
Yeah, but one of the last versions that I heard, he gave, and I think he made a very good case why Revelation was a purely literary creation and not a vision. I agreed with him too, but I agree with you guys, but I think he made a good case for it in that program.
Could you repeat that?
What you were saying earlier, that Revelation, you thought it was a literary creation, which I agree with you, but I just wanted to point out that Dr. Price on the Human Bible, probably the last edition of it, he makes a good case for that it's why he believes it's a purely literary creation and not a vision that he got.
Oh, okay, I gotcha.
That's interesting. I'll have to check that out.
Well, yeah, he's too dependent on earlier literature.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
There was a paper on Academia Edu that was written, I think, by might have been Raymond Dickey, one of the Bible geeks, and it was going into a lot of detail about the Left Behind books, and he mentions Dr. Price's book in there too, obviously, but he didn't read all the books, just up to a certain point. But one thing that kind of struck me as interesting is he was talking about how it's a work of fiction that's presenting the end as being actual occurrences, okay? But when it gets to the point of the part in Revelation where it talks about the woman who's clothed in the sun, giving birth to a baby, the dragon's waiting to devour the child, there's war in heaven, he doesn't actually write that up in the books, It's not like, okay, because it would sound totally ludicrous and ridiculous to try to fictionalize those events as if they're actually occurring historically as part of the context of the Left Behind books, okay? So in the books, they're presented as a vision that this rabbi who converted to Christianity has. So the rabbi says, I saw all this happen, rather than actually trying to present it as if it actually happened. Yeah,
really
and isn't it kind of like, if you could extrapolate that back, isn't that kind of like maybe what Revelation itself is that they've got to the point where, okay, we can't really say this is real history or this happened. We have to present it as if it was a vision or some kind of metaphor. Otherwise, it would sound totally ridiculous in reality.
I don't know. I feel like reading it, like it seems intentionally symbolic to me, I think.
Yeah, me too.
That's just the feeling I get.
Yeah, I'm not saying that it was actual visions, but...
Well, no, I mean, like, I don't think the author is saying, posing these as actual things that are going to happen, like...
Right.
But even to talk about them, you couldn't even present them as if this was really, something that was going on at the time that he was writing it, or as part of actual history. You would actually have to present it in a fictionalized way. Otherwise, it would sound kind of, just too bizarre.
Anyway, anybody interested in the book of Revelation, I highly recommend, if you have not already, reading the book we discussed in an earlier hangout, John Marshall's Parables of War.
Yeah,
I think the way he places the book is just, I don't know, miles ahead of other people's analysis of it.
Nah, read Dale's book.
Yeah, I need to read Dale's.
John, do you have a favorite commentary, since I know you weren't really going along with Marshall's view? You thought it was more in Domitian's wheelhouse, right?
I was looking at some videos on YouTube that got me started on trying to kind of align those guys up with the visuals.
Yeah, okay. Because
But
you
I
didn't
even
accept
I took
the
a different
short
take.
term. Yeah.
Yeah, I took a different take from that guy too, because he wanted to start it with Julius Caesar, and I preferred to start with Augustus. But yeah.
Okay.
I ended up going with the way that John takes that numbering, the numbering of the rulers, starting with Augustus.
And
But
do you include the guys that only were emperors for like a few months,
No, I don't.
like Otho and
No. So the last two I take as Vespasian and Titus.
Really?
I wanted to interject one more thing about Barker's book, because we're starting to get off topic and probably want to go off live pretty soon.
Yeah.
But one thing I noticed on page 94 is I'm looking at the chapter notes, and number 3 is El Nimoy.
Yeah, I saw that too.
It's spelled differently than Spock, but I don't know what the L stands for. Whether it's,
Well, Leonard Nimoy was Jewish, so he could have wrote that book.
but Spock's name is N-I-M-E-O-Y, so this is N-E-M-O-Y, but so it's a different Nimoy. But I just saw that name and was just like, wow, how does...
So, any final thoughts on chapters 4 or 5, or 4 and 5, or up to 5 so far?
One thing I want to mention is something we were discussing briefly, but I actually found the text that she was quoting about the lesser Yahweh. It's 3rd Enoch chapter 12 verse 5, and it says, "And he called me the lesser Yahweh in the presence of all his heavenly household, as it is written, for my name is in him." So that phrase is actually in the text, 3rd Enoch.
3rd Enoch, yeah. And that's in regards to Metatron.
Actually, I can't. Let me look in previous.
Because I think Melchizedek is called the little Yahweh. Metatron is the lesser Yahweh, and Melchizedek is the lesser Yahweh.
Yeah, that's how I remember it.
And that's really weird terminology. I mean, whatever framework you're looking at, like Old Testament, canonical, and apocryphal literature, those kind of things are going to stand out to you.
Yeah. It is weird because Yahweh, you don't see a lot of, like she pointed out, the Son of God chapter 1. You don't see any direct mention of a Son of Yahweh. You only see Son of El.
The Lord, Kyrios, right.
So yeah, you don't see a lot of use of his name, like duplicated.
Not just a lot, you never see it.
Yeah, like you're right. Before reading this book, I'd never heard of anything like that. Yeah, exactly.
That only goes to show how triumphant the Deuteronomic reform eventually became.
Yeah, really.
Of course, she's trying to say it wasn't that triumphant, right? There was the surviving earlier tradition up until the days of Christianity.
Yeah, that tradition and the other traditions all survived. They just branched out into different.
Right.
Right, like the
And honestly, that seems more natural to me. Like, I can't imagine any monolithic or even like a dual opposing monolithic, or what would you call it? Dualithic? I don't know. System. I would think like it would be more similar to, well, I wouldn't want to say Christianity today, because Christianity today is like really diverse, but I would imagine ancient Judaism as diverse in general. Like there may have been some core streams of tradition where like there were primary views, but I would imagine a lot of diversity.
Yeah,
Going way back, I mean.
Yeah, I think one aspect, like we were talking about her methodology, um, one aspect in which I can see it is actually has a certain inherent plausibility or high initial probability is because there are so many parallels to this kind of backwards reconstruction that she's trying to do. I
Yeah.
mean, that's what we do in evolution, you know. We have all these hypothetical common ancestors that in many cases, we have no direct evidence of, except in how they survive in their current descendants. So, and same with
Well,
languages.
we do have the other cultural surviving literature like Canaanite and Babylonian literature that has a similar story.
Right, but what I mean is like her main thesis that that these kind of I guess what's called the apocryphal writings and also early Christianity is preserving First Temple era traditions or pre-exilic traditions. And she's, I think, kind of the argument she's making is the same argument that biologists make when talking about common ancestors. She's saying all of these strands go back to an older common ancestor that must date back further for it to have these branches that went out all these different directions. The tree that all the branches came from has to go back even further. And I think we see that parallel in linguistics, as we were talking about earlier, how languages are just constantly branching off, but you have to see, if you see all these evidence, these commonalities between all these different languages, they must come from a common one that goes farther back. So I think if that's what she's saying, I think that has a high initial plausibility simply because that's just how everything else seems to happen.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
like we can reconstruct backwards from what survives today and find something older that we otherwise don't have independent evidence.
Yep. Exactly. All right. Well, we really should wrap it up. Good suggestion, John. How long have we been going? Over 3 hours, right? Yeah, over 3 hours, I think. When do we start? Like 6:45, something like that?
Yeah, well, around 40.
Okay, 6:27. Really?
Huh. I came in after 6:30.
Yeah, I
It
thought I
wasn't
came in
live
after
yet.
6:32. Anyway, yeah, so any final thoughts that you guys want to get in before we cut it off?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Anyone else? All right, I guess we're good. So next week, I think we're just reading one chapter. Yeah. No, I'm sorry, 2. Chapters 6 and 7, which is about 36 pages. So, I guess shorter chapters.
Evidence of the name and evidence of Philo. Sounds interesting.
Yeah, I'm glad we're going to be doing Philo. So, anyway, thanks everyone for coming. I really do appreciate it. It's great having all you guys here, having your opinions. And next week, The Great Angel, chapters 6 and 7. So, see you guys then, and yeah, that's it. Have a good night.